Chapter 504. You Rulon sighed. How could I not know that I've gone overboard? However, I'm the only one who's gone overboard, not you. Besides, I had no other choice. Shengguan Lingxiu is a good lady, of course. She's kind and good-looking, and her family background is extraordinary. She can be said to be a rare beauty in this world. But girl, this man, isn't anything else. You can't be silly on this point. It's because of her feelings for Yunyang that I've prompted Sister Yu to do this. Ji Lingxi asked in bewilderment, isn't anything else? What is it? Yu Rulon sighed again. I know that you're a silly girl who doesn't understand the ways of the world. As your elder sister, of course I have to think for you. Even when I know that I shouldn't, I have to do it. It's because Shengguan Lingxiu is kind, good-tempered, and beautiful that she's willing to disregard a girl's modesty for Yunyang that I've done this. If she wasn't so outstanding and had done so many things, why would I need to worry about you and be the bad guy? Ji Lingxi was still confused. Huh? Yu Rulon felt helpless for her sister-in-law's ignorance of the world and explained weakly, let me ask you. You like Yunyang, we both know this. However, have you ever thought of marrying him? To be together forever? Ji Lingxi stomped her feet and covered her burning cheeks. Sister Lan, how can you say such shameful things? Yu Rulon said, there's only the two of us now. What's there to hide? Let me ask you, Shengguan Lingxiu likes Yunyang too. She's a girl, yet she's hugging Yunyang without a care in the world. If she's not moved by him, how could she do so? She wouldn't do so even if it's in front of two armies. Therefore, deep down she must be hoping that she and Yunyang will be together. Here's the question, if the two of you were to compete, would you and Yunyang be a pair? Or would she be with Yunyang for a long time? Ji Lingxi paled. It's an undeniable fact that she treats you so well and that she's a good person. But it's also an indisputable fact that she likes the same man as you. Will you give in just because she's a good person? Are you going to give your lifelong happiness to her? Yu Rulon asked in a low voice. Ji Lingxi grew even more perplexed as she mumbled, I really didn't think that far ahead. Yu Rulon smiled bitterly. So, how can I not be the villain? I'm already destined to suffer for the rest of my life. Don't tell me I have to watch you, his only sister, suffer for the rest of your life? Ji Lingxi was at a loss. It was obvious that she had never thought that in such a short time, with just a few simple words, her sister Lan had already fought Shengguan Lingxiu on her behalf more than once. But, is there no other way? Ji Lingxi murmured. Yu Rulon held her forehead with one hand, speechless. This silly girl, can you find another way to do this? Can you find another way? If he fought for it, he might regret it. But if he didn't, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Yunyang had fallen into a coma due to excessive blood loss and mental and physical exhaustion. Qiu Jianhan, who had been nourished by Yunyang's blood, was lucky enough to survive, but he was still unconscious. Yutang's two hidden and visible personages were both unconscious, but the war would not stop because of them. Perhaps, it should be said that the war of the century between the two empires would not stop because of anyone or anything. In fact, even from the moment Qiu Jianhan was rescued, the war between the two empires had not stopped for even a moment. Fu Baogua had spent all his time arranging his troops to defend against Dong Xian when he was not concerned about the old marshal. Fortunately, the old marshal had bought him a few days of time. Fu Baogua had used the terrain he had built these days to almost engage Dong Xian. What made Fu Baogua feel the most fortunate was that Han Sanhe had not made a move ever since he had defeated Qiu Jianhan. All the battles now were being commanded by Zhang Gu. Although Zhang Gu could be ranked among the world's famous generals with his incisive tactics and strategic planning, he was not far from Han Sanhe. However, Fu Baogua had always felt that he could cope and persevere with the limited military strength he currently had. If Fu Baogua had to give a reason, it would probably be that as long as he was not facing Han Sanhe, the suffocating feeling of being in the middle of a raging storm did not exist. Yes, when he faced Han Sanhe, he felt like he was being suppressed and unusually passive. Now, however, even though his available military strength was still not much, almost twice of the other parties, he always felt more confident that he would not fall, that he would not lose. The truth was just like Fu Baogua's judgment. Every mistake Zhang Gu made in the war, or rather, it should be called a mistake, it should be, the gap between commands, Fu Baogua could always grasp it accurately. Then he would counterattack or seize the opportunity to regroup and stabilize the perilous situation on his side. The situation was getting more and more disadvantageous for Yutang because Yutang's military strength was decreasing rapidly in the battle. How could they not pay a considerable price in order to fight an enemy that outnumbered them? However, Fu Baogua could still maintain his composure. The time they had held out had far exceeded their expectations. Every day they could hold out was already a gain. Every day they could hold out, Yutong's chances of winning this war would increase. Fu Baogua did not hold back anymore. He divided his steel cavalry into 3 squads and attacked in turns. The remnants of the Baogua army formed 2 squads as well, supporting the attack with the steel cavalry. Other than that, Fu Baogua had also formed a specialized vanguard team with the ace cultivators in the troop. This group of people was led by Bai Yixue, Fang Mafei, and Marquis Yun. Their role was to attack the enemy's formation in turns. In spite of this, they would only launch their attacks when the enemy's tactics were lacking. Only then could they ensure that each attack could cause massive damage to the enemy while minimizing the number of casualties on their side. Now, Fu Baogua had gradually realized where his side's advantage lay. Perhaps, his military strength, combat power, and number of people were not as good, and his overall situation was far behind the enemy. Furthermore, his defense line was in danger and could be breached at any time. In spite of this, his biggest advantage now was the fact that he had 3 superb experts to watch over him. Bai Yixue, Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, Fang Mafei. The martial skills of these 3 people were unparalleled among the millions of soldiers of the 2 countries in this decisive battle. They were also his biggest trump card, his strongest asset. Fu Baogua ran over with a drooling face. Brothers, help me charge a little more." Bai Yixue was the most unfortunate of them all. Whenever something like this happened, he was the one who led the team 7 out of 10 times. Who asked him to have the highest cultivation base. Besides, there were other reasons. "Big brother, I've just charged once." Bai Yixue was even less courteous to Fu Baogua now, not even addressing him as marshal but as big brother. To be called big brother by a heaven realm ace cultivator, Fu Baogua should feel honored. "Cough, old marshal's situation isn't very stable?" Marquis Yun said, "I'm a little worried." What if? Before Marquis of Heavenly Clouds could finish his words, Bai Yixue had already charged out with a dark expression. The sentence that he did not finish was the magic weapon that rendered Bai Yixue speechless. Qiu Jianhan had been shot by an arrow under his protection. It was a sure fire. "Old Fang, it's your turn next, isn't it?" "Old Bai?" Fang Mafei sighed. "Young master is still unconscious. I'm worried. What if he's shot by an arrow?" Thus Bai Yixue charged out again with a dark expression. He was cursing inwardly. "Oh man, can't you King catch me? Just because of such a trivial matter, you're treating me like a laborer and ordering me around? How dare you? To think that I, Bai Yixue, was famous in the martial world back then, let alone the me now." Bai Yixue grumbled bitterly. "Sigh. Who was the person I was protecting back then? I'd been through hundreds of battles along the way. When I reached the destination, I was covered in wounds from head to toe and almost died. But guess what happened to the person I was protecting?" Marquis Yin asked. "I'm not guessing. I'll just lead the team in charge." Bai Yixue charged out again, his face flushed. "Oh man, you really can't make mistakes." This was Bai Yixue's reflection on this incident. If his weakness was really caught, he would not be able to turn the tables for a very, very long time. Although the situation had taken a turn for the better, Fu Baogua, as Yutong's marshal, was still uneasy. He was even more confused. According to the current situation, as long as Han Sanhe pushed harder and broke through Tianshan Cliff, he would be able to sweep through the empire of Yutong. There would be no more obstacles. At the same time, it would also mean that the merit of the empire of Dongxuan's expansion would be in their hands. Furthermore, Dongxuan's position as the continent's hegemon would be established from then on, perhaps even stabilized once and for all. However, Han Sanhe had suddenly stopped caring at this critical juncture. He had handed everything over to Zhang Ge. He had gone to the side to drink tea. What did this mean? Fu Baogua thought that this was incomprehensible. If it had been him, why would he not follow up on his victory at this juncture? Even if Han Sanhe wanted to train his troops and groom his successor, there was no need to do so at this juncture, was there? It was important to teach a disciple and train a successor, but was there really a need to train him at this juncture? To put it nicely, it was losing the greater good because of a small gain, but to put it in a more serious manner, it was a hindrance to the military's plans. The crime was unpardonable. Furthermore, it was obvious that they wanted to hand over the great credit of expanding their territory to Zhang Ge. This made Fu Baogua even more confused. Was Han Sanhe an idiot? Chapter 505. Fu Baogua was at a loss. He thought about it again and again, but he could not figure out what Han Sanhe was thinking or what he was plotting. Now that the fortress of resilience had been breached, Yutong's natural barrier had been lost. Although the new defense line that they had built was known as another fortress of resilience, where the people lived, the fortress would cease to exist if the people died. Fu Baogua felt that the pressure he was currently under was not as strong as when he was at the fortress of resilience. It was undeniable that Zhang Gu was a top-notch marshal. Although he was still not as good as Fu Baogua, he had slowly pushed Dongshen to the edge of victory with the initiative that he had accumulated bit by bit. Up until now, both Zhang Gu and Fu Baogua knew very well that the final battle would probably happen within a day or two. The final outcome would definitely be Yutong's defeat. This point was already the general trend and no one could change it. Fu Baogua had stood his ground until now. Watching his men die one by one, he was already well aware of the situation. Although he was better than Zhang Gu in terms of military strategy, and his thoughts were more experienced and meticulous, he could not make bricks without straw. Tianshan Cliff would be the last battle of his life. If he did not become a deserter, he would definitely fall here. There would be no chance of survival. However, whether it was as Yutong's Eastern Frontline Marshal, the person who had made a pact with Supreme Wind that day, or just a Yutong citizen, Fu Baogua would never allow a second stain to be tainted in his life. I, Fu Baogua, would rather die here than take another step back. This is the Fortress of Resilience as well. I couldn't fulfill my vow to fall with the Fortress of Resilience. Let me truly live and die with this Fortress of Resilience that I've built with my own hands. Teacher, why? Zhang Gu had the same doubt as Fu Baogua. Han Sanhe looked at the dark clouds in the sky with his arms behind his back and said faintly, I thought you would understand. In the end you still managed to ask. Zhang Gu was taken aback. Teacher? Han Sanhe sighed dejectedly, you will understand, Zhang Gu. I only hope that when the time comes, you won't take the wrong path. Zhang Gu was shocked and blurted out, Teacher, could it be? Han Sanhe waved his hand ending the topic. He turned to look at Zhang Gu and said, do you know why I want you to defeat Fu Baogua personally? Zhang Gu said, Teacher, please dispel my doubts. This disciple will respectfully receive your teachings. Han Sanhe said slowly, there are many strange things in this world. There were also many strange things happening on the battlefield. But how did a famous general grow up? Based on this old man's lifetime of experience, there is only one path, and that is to step on the corpses of other famous generals to rise. This conclusion is also applicable to the commander-in-chief of an army. Only by defeating a commander-in-chief who is of the same level or higher than him can one rise to fame. If this was all, it would still be within the scope of an ordinary person's understanding. However, there's another strange thing about this duel. When you fight a famous marshal on the battlefield and finally defeat him, you'll unknowingly learn his commanding method. It's like you've suddenly learned a lesson, a feeling of enlightenment that grows inexplicably. You've learned it all at once and you've improved. You've taken a huge step forward to an extent that you can't even imagine. Han Sanhe said, this is something that outsiders can't understand. Only the person involved will know. From what I understand, it's probably because you've fought him 8 to 10 times. It's the same battle before, but as long as there's no winner or loser, no life and death, you won't have this sudden epiphany. Once there's a life and death outcome, you'll definitely have this epiphany. Do you understand now? Defeating and killing Fu Baogua is your chance. Han Sanhe said softly but with a hint of melancholy, when you really defeat Fu Baogua, you'll be able to understand half of what I'm thinking now. Zhang Gu was shaken, but he said respectfully, thank you for your guidance, teacher. Han Sanhe said slowly, it's too early to thank me. If you can defeat Tai Jing, then you'll understand 70% of me. If you defeat Lung Daoyin, you'll understand 90% of me. Zhang Gu felt like a war drum was ringing in his heart, unable to speak for a moment. Han Sanhe said slowly, as for fully understanding me, you'll have to fight me head-on and defeat me. Only then can you understand me completely. What I can't figure out now. I'm afraid you'll be able to figure it out by then. Zhang Gu was sweating profusely. How dare this disciple have such extravagant hopes? Han Sanhe smiled faintly and said, where there's a will, there's a way. How will you know if you don't work hard? Now go and command the battle. If my calculations aren't wrong, the outcome will be decided before dawn the day after tomorrow. This war will end by the second half of tomorrow night at the latest. Fu Baogua walked towards Qiu Jianhan's tent with a grim expression. Qiu Jianhan was still unconscious. However, there was an additional person in front of his bed. It was Yin Yang. Yin Yang was almost fully recovered by now. How is it, Marshal Fu? Yin Yang asked with a smile. This puzzled Fu Baogua. He had never met this young Master Yun before, had he? Why did he feel like he was very familiar with him when he spoke to him now? Not good. Not good at all. Fu Baogua sighed. The situation is really not good now. Fu Baogua said with a grim expression, Young Master Yun, I have a favor to ask of you. I hope young Master Yun won't reject it. Yun Yang said in a low voice, Please speak, Marshal Fu. As long as it's within my capabilities, I won't hesitate. The defeat of this war is inevitable. Even if there are 1,000 clever plans, there's no turning back. This war can be lost, but Yutong can't be destroyed. The elites of our nation can't be wiped out here. Fu Baogua said word by word, So, I'd like to ask young Master Yun to escort Old Marshal away. Only with young Master Yun's personal escort can Old Marshal return safely and I can be at ease. Yun Yang asked seriously, What about you? Fu Baogua did not answer. After a pause he said, Shengguan family of generals young Lady Lingxiu is the current benchmark of the family. She's significant and can't be allowed to perish here. Your father, Marquis Yun, Bai Yi, Fang Mafei, and the rest are all elites of the empire. It would be the empire's misfortune if they were sacrificed in vain here. Other than that, the Shengguan family of generals 8,000 family warriors have fought until now. There are still more than 2,700 people left. Young master, please don't feel burdened. The escort troop that I can give you this time won't be more than 5,000 people. Without these people, how can everything be done? I'd like to make it clear here that this mission is by no means easy. In fact, it's exceptionally arduous. Perhaps it can be said that the empire's future, whether it can rise again and be reborn, all rests on your shoulders. Fu Baogua's expression was cold, indescribably determined. Yun Yang asked again, I understand what you've said, but I'd like to ask Marshal Fu to answer me. What about you, Marshal Fu? What about you? Fu Baogua smiled faintly. I, Fu Baogua, have promised Lord Supreme Cloud that I'll live and die with the Fortress of Resilience. It's a pity that I've gone back on my word under Old Marshal's strict orders. Even if I say that I'll build another Fortress of Resilience, I've still gone back on my word. However, no matter how much I've gone back on my word, I can't run away in a fluster when I've arrived at Tianshan Cliff with the 9 Supremes Lord Spirits watching from above. As a soldier of Yutong, a citizen of Yutong, dying on the battlefield before the country is destroyed is the greatest honor of a soldier. Fu Baogua said softly, As a soldier, if I'm still alive when the country is destroyed, it'll only be the greatest humiliation of my life. There's no way to wash it away. Yun Yang snorted and said, What are you talking about? Even if the country is destroyed, what about the soldiers who are still fighting unyieldingly, who are still contributing to the recovery of the country? I say they're all heroic men. How can they bear the humiliation that they can't wash away for the rest of their lives? Fu Baogua said faintly, Of course they're heroes, they're deserving heroes. However, they've never been at the front line before. I, Fu Baogua, am at the front line now. This is the difference. If I can't die here, it'll be a humiliation that can never be washed away in this world. Yun Yang was silent. He understood what Fu Baogua meant. The frontline defense troops' duty was to protect the country. If it was breached by the enemy, it would be an unpardonable crime. No matter what reason, there was no irresistible factor, no matter what, this crime could not be erased. Even when the entire nation understood that it was a last resort and could be forgiven, they themselves would never forgive themselves. They would always be brooding over it, unable to let it go. Furthermore, how many people in this world were actually rational enough to put themselves in the shoes of these border warriors? When the situation really came to a head, how many people would dare say that they could forgive them? Regarding my own safety, there's no need for young master to worry about it. I only have this one request. I hope that young Master Yun can help me, Fu Baogua said. Yun Yang asked curiously, There are so many people here and everyone seems to be more powerful than me, more suitable to deal with the current crisis than I am. Marshal Fu, why do you have to look for me? Aren't you thinking too highly of me? Fu Baogua smiled. Why does old Marshal think so highly of you? Why did old Marshal not look for anyone else but you at the very last moment? He doesn't even allow a third person to be present. These are my reasons. Chapter 506. The only regret of this battle is that I didn't get to see Lord Supreme Cloud and I don't know how he's doing now. Fu Baogua sighed deeply. I only hope that Lord Supreme Cloud is blessed by the heavens and that he's well. To me, no, to all of Yutong's subjects and people, as long as Lord Supreme Cloud is still here, Yutong still has hope. Fu Baogua's eyes were looking at the distant sky, his gaze filled with nostalgia and gratitude. Yun Yang said softly, I didn't expect Marshal Fu to trust Lord Supreme Cloud so much. Fu Baogua's head was still raised, his voice unusually indifferent. When Lord Supreme Cloud turned into Supreme Wind, he enlightened me and gave me a new life. If it weren't for Lord Supreme Cloud, I would have lost my reputation and died without a complete corpse. Yun Yang was shocked. He did not expect Fu Baogua to expose himself in front of someone other than Supreme Cloud. Yun Yang was only Yun Yang, not Supreme Cloud. Naturally, that was how Fu Baogua felt. That day it was Lord Supreme Cloud who pulled me out of the abyss. Fu Baogua said reverently, Lord Supreme Cloud is one of the two people I, Fu Baogua, respect the most in my life. The other one is my teacher, Fang Qingtian. Yun Yang said, Old Grand Commandant Fang is of course highly respected, but Lord Supreme Cloud? He wanted to say that Lord Supreme Cloud did not expect to be repaid for his kindness and did not wish for Fu Baogua to die in the battlefield, but before he could finish his sentence, Fu Baogua turned to glare at him and said loudly, Ignorant child, although your surname is also Yun and you're also the son of Marquis of Heavenly Clouds, a descendant of the royal family, and you've made great contributions, there are some things that should be said and some things that shouldn't be said in this world. I've blurted out the past in a moment of life and death, but I've heard such rebellious words. It looks like Marquis Yun's upbringing needs to be strengthened. Yun Yang was stunned. Fu Baogua's anger had yet to dissipate. Young Marquis Yun, considering that we've been comrades, let me give you a piece of advice here. Thinking too highly of yourself isn't a big problem, but it's still a problem. Keep your mouth shut in the future, lest you bring death upon yourself. At least in front of me, don't make any presumptuous comments about Lord Supreme Cloud. You have no right to say anything good or bad about Lord Supreme Cloud. After saying that, he flicked his sleeves and left with a cold expression. He had left Yun Yang alone on the spot. Yun Yang was dumbfounded, speechless. What did I say? I'm just saying good things. I'm thinking about you. Why can't you tell the difference between good and bad? So what if I'm talking about Supreme Cloud? I'm talking about him. What can he do to me? Supreme Cloud hasn't even said anything, and you're the one who needs to stand up for him? And what the hell was going on? I'm just speaking up for myself, and there are actually people who are defending me. It's so King awkward. This round of scolding was really a torrent of scolding. Night fell. This was actually the calmest night since the start of the war. Both sides knew that tomorrow would be the moment that would decide the outcome of the war. Yutong knew that tomorrow might be the day of their defeat, while Dongshan knew that they would charge past Tianshan Cliff in the battle tomorrow. From then on, the empire of Yutong and the fertile lands in the east would all belong to Dongshan, free to be ravaged. On this night, Dongshuan's troops were resting and building up their strength. Generals of all levels were lecturing and promising that as long as the battle was won tomorrow, how they would be promoted, how they would be crowned nobility for generations to come, how they would be rewarded, how they would. The eyes of the soldiers who listened were glowing with greed. Everyone was subconsciously imagining that after tomorrow's battle, they would be rewarded with unparalleled military merits and riches. If they could make more contributions, it might really be like what the officers had said, they would be crowned nobility for generations to come. Yutong's side, on the other hand, was silent. Everyone was trying their best to rest and adjust themselves so that they could have stronger stamina the next day. At the last moment, they had to kill as many invaders as possible. 1 or 2 would barely break even, 3 or 5 would be a profit, and if they could kill 8 or 10, that would be the final harvest that they would be able to die in peace. Countless people were silent, their heads lowered. However, the unprecedented aura of grief and indignation gradually spread throughout the entire army. They had fought until now, persevered until now, but were they still at the very last moment? Countless sacrifices, facing death countless times, but tomorrow was the end of the world. Was this the end of their lives? A veteran covered in wounds silently wiped the long saber he carried with him and sang in a low voice. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield, fighting for the country all one's life, the ambition to fight on the battlefield. When the enemy comes, the bridge we pass. Brother, you grab your saber, I raise my spear. Charging and breaking through the enemy lines together, riding and wielding our sabers together. Celebrating with wine, the long mountain road together, the long journey to the underworld together. Brothers are comrades in arms are comrades. You don't lower your head, I don't bend my back either. I face life and death, splendor in one hand. I come to my battlefield, you go to your trench, because we're the pride of our hometown elders. You have your old mother, I have my young family. You have your beauty, I have my daughter. When the saber and spear are in hand, when the enemy comes, my chest, my blood is burning. When I turn into dust, it's also a soldier's glory. When you burn and turn into a rainbow bridge in the sky, brothers, we still smile proudly. Because we're Yutong's pride. You have the blood in your chest, I have the saber in my hand. You and I, side by side, fight today. If I die in battle, father and mother should smile. What's the point of a man's life if he doesn't defend his country? Father and mother miss me. Look towards the east. Look at the place where the flames of war are rising. I'm smiling proudly. Smile proudly for the rest of my life. Smile proudly for life and death. The volume of the song was extremely low. This was a song called Smile Proudly, composed by a soldier after a battle. It had gradually become popular throughout Yutong's military, becoming a popular military song that almost everyone could sing. At this moment, the hoarse voice was singing softly, but it seemed to carry a strange rhythm as it floated slowly in the night breeze. All of the soldiers who heard the song began to sing along with it. Some of the soldiers sang as they took out their letters from home, reading the letters that they had read so many times that they would shatter with just a flip. Even when the letters were already stained with blood and had covered their original contents, the audience read them greedily, word by word, over and over again. When they were done, they kept them carefully and placed them in the most intimate spot. There were tears in their eyes, but there was a smile on the corners of their lips. Some of the soldiers rested their heads on their sabers, watching the twinkling stars in the sky without blinking. Their thoughts were unknown, but they could only sing along softly. Gradually, the singing spread throughout Yutong's military camp, reaching the mountain where the army was. It was like a gentle breeze lingering to and fro. Fu Baoguo was also humming a song, inspecting his troops from tent to tent. Before the battle that was destined to come tomorrow, he wanted to look at each and every one of his brothers at least once. He wanted to remember the image of each of his brothers in his heart forever. Even when his soul had departed to the netherworld, he dared not forget them. He could not forget them. Are you afraid of death? I was, but I'm not anymore. What do you mean? Why aren't you afraid now? Because I'm not afraid now. Fu Baoguo recalled the young soldier who was not even 20 years old when he had asked the question and the soldier's reply. He could not help chuckling, tears in his laughter. Although the soldier was only 20 years old, he was already a veteran who had gone through many battles. In the course of his young life, the battles he had gone through were numerous, if not uncountable. Tomorrow we will die in battle. Fu Baoguo's voice echoed. Brothers, who has any unfulfilled wishes? Speak quickly. If it's possible, I'll do my best to help him complete it. This might be the last chance. If you don't speak now, there won't be another chance. The song was still melodious, but no one answered. Following me, Fu Baoguo, to die, does anyone regret it? There was still no reply. The song continued in a mellow tone. Then I'll nag one more time. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. It will still be me, Fu Baoguo, who will lead all of you to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy. It was Fu Baoguo's voice. The military camp that had been silent all this while suddenly roared deafeningly. That's right. If we die in battle tomorrow, our heroic souls will still guard here and continue to fight against Dongxian. Going to the netherworld and gather our heroic souls to fight against the enemy? In the human realm, we won't rest until we die. In the netherworld, we won't rest until we die. No regrets. We don't regret it. The deafening roar was like the roar of a thunder god descending upon the world, ringing deafeningly through the entire mountain, shaking the 9 heavens. In the end, there were only 5 neat words: we don't regret it. We don't regret it. Shengguan Lingxiu, who was watching the scene from the top of the mountain, covered her mouth and choked with sobs. Big drops of tears rolled down her fair cheeks. She felt as if something was stuck in her throat. Fu Baoguo's Adam's apple bobbed up and down, unable to speak for a moment. His breathing was unusually heavy, like a broken bellow. Suddenly he roared like a lion, "Fight to the end! Fight to the end!" Their ears were filled with the thunderous roar. Fu Baoguo suddenly guffawed. Brothers, all of us here, remember to leave together tomorrow. No one is to be left behind. Your father's military law allows for beheading whether it's the netherworld or the living world. This is military discipline. There was a burst of laughter as the soldiers chortled. Your father won't be left behind. Not when we're alive, not when we're dead. What's there to be afraid of military discipline for? Let's sing. Continue singing. Fu Baoguo roared. None of you have seen your father sing, have you? Your father will start today and let you know your father's songs. Then Fu Baoguo was silent for a moment, as if he was brewing his emotions. All the soldiers stood up at that moment, puffing their chests as they waited quietly for the song that they had never heard before. The song that came from Marshal Fu. A moment later, Fu Baoguo's passionate voice rang out. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield. I wrote this song until 4 last night. It took me a long time to revise it. Chapter 507. The 100,000-strong army, whether they were injured, resting, or on duty, echoed almost at the same time. Brothers at home, comrades on the battlefield. The song was led by Fu Baogua. The chorus was loud and majestic. How could a chorus of more than 100,000 people not be loud and majestic? At this very moment, all of Yutong's soldiers could feel their blood boiling. The entire sky and earth were trembling, fighting because of the singing of Yutong's soldiers. The song spread far and wide, reaching the clouds. The vigor of facing death with equanimity, the determination to fight until the very last moment, was as solid as a rock, unshakable, indestructible, and indestructible. It was so loud that even Dongxuan's camp could hear it loud and clear. The fervent pre-battle mobilization also involuntarily came to a halt. Many of Dongxuan's generals walked up to the higher ground in silence, gazing at the pitch-black hill on the other side. The deafening song was coming from the other side of the hill, their gazes filled with uncontrollable respect. Zhang Gu also stared at the other side of the hill in silence, his gaze exceptionally complicated. Only Han Sanhe remained in his tent, not observing Yutong's movements. He stood with his arms behind his back, but the complicated expression on his lean face flickered back and forth. After some time he finally walked out of the tent with his arms on his back and came to the top of the hill. Zhang Gu was already standing there, looking at Yutong's camp. Seeing Han Sanhe's arrival, he turned to greet him at once. "Teacher Yu," there was hesitation and respect in his voice, but more than that, it was a contradiction that stemmed from his own self-doubt. "It looks like you've realized it as well?" Han Sanhe said faintly. The song was still reverberating endlessly. Even the mountains and valleys around Dongxuan's camp were reverberating from the rumbling. Zhang Gu swallowed with difficulty and said, "Yes, I feel that tomorrow's battle will be the most tragic battle I've ever encountered in my life. I actually have doubts about this battle that I've already grasped victory in." A bitter smile hung on Han Sanhe's bony face as he said, "Your feeling is right. The battle tomorrow will be unexpectedly brutal, but the outcome is still predetermined. Dongxian will win, but it will be a Pyrrhic victory. Perhaps it will be a losing battle. I've only encountered such an army once in all the battles I've been through in my life." Han Sanhe uttered word by word, 100,000 troops, 100,000 men of sacrifice. "This is too scary." Zhang Gu said, "Once? Back then, when we were fighting Shangguan Lingxiao, we had set up an ambush and bribed our spies. The encirclement was complete, trapping Shangguan Lingxiao in Sobbing Ghost Valley, 700 miles away from the Fortress of Resilience. We deployed 150,000 men and surrounded Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men. That battle was just like that." Han Sanhe's tone was filled with nostalgia. "What was the result of that battle?" Zhang Gu asked respectfully. "I was personally in charge of commanding 150,000 men on our side. Against 20,000 men, we had set up an ambush in advance, our bows and arrows in place. It was a perfect time, place, and manpower. All three factors were in place. Our odds of victory were set in stone. There was no way we would fail." Han Sanhe sighed. As for the result of that battle, none of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men survived. All of them were annihilated. When the battlefield was cleaned up after the battle, less than 500 of Shangguan Lingxiao's 20,000 men could be found with their corpses intact, Han Sanhe said seriously. Zhang Gu suddenly felt goosebumps all over his body, a chill running down his spine as he asked anxiously, "What about us?" He was very familiar with his teacher's habits. By saying things like this, he was laying out the foundation for his side's losses. His side's losses would be a number that would greatly exceed his own expectations. Han Sanhe said faintly, "Of the 150,000 men, only 76,300 came back alive." Zhang Gu felt his heart skip a beat, breathing labored for a moment, his eyes almost seeing stars. They had the advantage of a geographical ambush and an insider, but they had still suffered a 1-to-4 casualty ratio. How is this possible? How could we, who had the advantage of time, place, and manpower, have suffered such casualties? Preposterous. Preposterous. Zhang Gu, who thought he had mentally prepared himself, blurted out, disbelief written all over his face. "Why is it impossible? I was there that day, I witnessed it with my own eyes. Thinking about it now, it's still vivid in my mind, engraved in my soul." Han Sanhe said, "Did you know that some of the enemy soldiers were slashed dozens of times, lying on the ground motionless? They were actually waiting for Dongshuan soldiers to pass by before they pounced on them, biting their targets' throats with the last bit of their strength. When the corpses were collected, more than 30 soldiers died in vain because of this. Do you know, after that battle, only about 200 of Dongshuan's 76,300 people were lightly injured? The rest of them were basically unscathed. No, I should say that among those who survived, there wasn't a single one who was heavily injured. Zhang Gu was a general who knew his soldiers well, understanding the deeper meaning of Han Sanhe's words at once. His face paled at once. What a cruel battle that had been. Not even a single one was lightly injured. Not a single one was heavily injured. Those who were slightly injured were all dead. That battle was Shangguan Lingxiao's last battle. It was also the last battle of the Shangguan family of generals. It was also the last time this old man and the Shangguan family of generals will fight. Han Sanhe sucked in a deep breath. Since then, this old man's respect for the Shangguan family of generals has exceeded that of anyone else. I don't even want to meet any heirs of the Shangguan family of generals anymore. He turned to look at Zhang Gu. Zhang Gu, what you're going to face tomorrow might very well be another Shangguan Lingxiao. Fu Baogua is even stronger and more fearless than Shangguan Lingxiao was back then. Most importantly, the total number of troops under him is 5 times more than Shangguan Lingxiao's. Also, the morale boost before us has greatly surpassed Shangguan Lingxiao's. Against such morale, no matter how many casualties there are, it won't weaken. Unless the other side is completely wiped out, there's no chance of victory. There seemed to be a ball of fire burning in Han Sanhe's eyes. Lastly, if you win, you'll never forget Fu Baogua for a moment in your entire life. He'll become the most important person in your life. If you lose, Han Sanhe closed his eyes, then it'll be eternal damnation. Are you ready? Zhang Gu felt his heart tremble as a sharp glint shot out from his eyes. I'm ready. If he, who had 1,000,000 men under his command, were to be defeated by Fu Baogua's 100,000 men, there would be no need for eternal damnation. He could just cut his own throat. What was the point of living? As a general, there has to be a battle that he has to face in his life, a battle that he has to overcome. Only by going through such a battle can he truly ascend to the position of a peerless marshal. Han Sanhe said faintly, "This is your chance and also your catastrophe." The singing on the other side did not stop. Not only did it not stop, it grew louder and more intense. In spite of this, the sharpness in Zhang Ji's gaze grew sharper. He sucked in a deep breath and said, "Teacher, don't worry. Tomorrow I will definitely win this battle." Han Sanhe nodded. Then Zhang Gu asked humbly, "Teacher, what strategy do you think I should adopt tomorrow?" Han Sanhe narrowed his eyes and said faintly, "I can help you make decisions for all the battles in the past. However, I can't do that for tomorrow's battle. All of my suggestions, regardless of the pros and cons, will hinder you." Han Sanhe said slowly, "I only have one last thing to tell you." Zhang Gu said sternly, "Please speak, teacher. This disciple will learn." Chapter 508. Han Sanhe had gone back to rest for more than 2 hours. Zhang Gu was still at the top of the mountain, deep in thought. Determination to die. Determination to die. Zhang Ji's gaze grew brighter and more resolute. Fu Baogua asked, "Has old Marshal's carriage left?" "It's been 4 hours since it left the base." "Good. Has young Master Yin left?" "I didn't see him." "He should have left with old Marshal." "Good. That's great." Fu Baogua heaved a long sigh of relief. "This Marshal can then be free of worries and fight to the death with all my might." Yun Yang took advantage of the dark night and sprinted like a wisp of smoke towards Tianshan Cliff at full speed. The Temple of the Nine Supremes stood at the highest point of Tianshan Cliff. It was the destination of Yun Yang's trip. "I'm sorry, brothers. I have to take this step after all. I can't afford to hesitate when it's a matter of life and death." Yun Yang stood alone before the Temple of the Nine Supremes in the dark of the night. The long-awaited Temple of the Nine Supremes was right before his eyes. The majestic Yutong, the mighty Nine Supremes. Just the 8 words at the door made Yun Yang stop and stare at them for a long time. It was precisely these 8 words that had created countless massacres and blood debts. After a moment's pause, he slowly stepped into the place he had not visited for a long time. Standing alone in the middle of the hall, Yun Yang was at a loss as he stared at the 9 Supremes' silent statues. At this moment, it was as if he had become one of the 9 statues and no longer belonged to this world. "If there's no other choice, I really don't want to use your powers," Yun Yang murmured. "This younger brother has really gone to the end of the line. No matter how reluctant I am, no matter how indignant I am, everything that is happening right now is not what my brothers would like to see. If Yutong were to fall just like this young brother would be too ashamed to meet my brothers in the afterlife, so... Other than Yunyang, there was probably no one else in this world who did not know that Tianshan Cliff was hiding a huge secret about the Nine Supremes. During the battle at Tianshan Cliff, the spiritual restraining formation had sealed all of the Nine Supremes' energy within their physical bodies, rendering them unable to use any of it. It was also after that battle that the Nine Supremes had fallen. It could be said to be Yutong's greatest regret in the last 100 years. The Nine Supremes were annihilated. However, it was also because of the spiritual restraining formation that the Nine Supremes' power did not dissipate even in death, being sealed within the boundaries of Tianshan Cliff. Other than the residents of Nine Supremes, the force belonged to heaven and earth. Even though the original owner had died, the force was sealed here and had not weakened at all. Even if a man dies, his strength lives on. That was because the power of these 9 attributes originally belonged to the vast sky and the earth. It was only because of a special method like the spirit controlling array that it was temporarily sealed. However, it was also because of this that this secret had been hidden in this place for a long time. If no one came to draw it, then perhaps after a very long time, this energy would gradually dissipate bit by bit, gradually vanish, and once again transform into the spiritual energy of the world. To be able to draw upon the Nine Supreme spiritual power, one must possess the same cultivation method. Other than that, even if the person's cultivation base was astounding, there was nothing that could be done. In spite of this, perhaps heaven and earth were fated to be mysterious and mysterious. One of the 9 Supremes had survived. Supreme Cloud. Supreme Cloud, one of the 9 Supremes, had come and personally activated this force. As long as he was willing, he could draw upon it effortlessly. Yunyang had known about the existence of this force since a long time ago. Since the day he returned to the residence of 9 Supremes for the first time, he had sensed another place where the 9 Supremes' spiritual power gathered in this world. As long as Yunyang arrived there, he could use the massive amount of spiritual power to elevate himself tremendously. However, Yunyang had never drawn upon the power of this place. He did not even have the thought of doing so. He had been preserving this spiritual power. Even the last time, he would rather destroy his own body to cultivate the power of wind and fire with all his might than use this force. There was no other reason other than this was the last bit of power his brothers had left in this world. It was also an irrefutable proof that his brothers were still alive. If this force were to be used, there might really be nothing left. There would be no more traces of the other 9 Supremes in this world. By then, today however, Yunyang felt that he had been forced into a dead end. If he did not use this force, Yutong would definitely lose. The entire country would be under Dongshuan's iron hooves. The people would be plunged into misery, the nation would be annihilated. The land of Yutong was the land that he and his brothers had protected for their entire lives. How could they watch it be destroyed like this? Yunyang knelt down silently and knocked his head hard on the ground. When he stood up, his forehead was covered in blood. Brothers, Xiaojiu is useless, please forgive me. It was midnight. When Dongshin had yet to make a move, Yutong had actually made the first move, taking the initiative to attack. Yutong's warriors were dressed neatly. It was not that the soldiers did not want to clean themselves, but it was because there were rarely any soldiers who did not have blood stains on them throughout the battle. Their armor and clothing were still intact, but even if there were blood stains on them, even if their clothes were tattered, they still tried their best to tidy themselves up. The torn areas were mended as best as they could, their belts were tied tightly and their pants were tied neatly. They looked indescribably neat and tidy. They set off in neat rows, their armors bright and clean. Even their helmets were immaculately polished. Their faces were also the part that was uniformly clean. Everyone's faces were washed and many of the soldiers had even washed their hair. It was as if what they were about to face was not a battle to the death, but an important person. Troops after troops came out from the mountains, the forest, and the campsite, lining up on the plains in front of the mountain. Yutong's soldiers marched and lined up, singing in unison. Looking afar, Yutong's soldiers did not look like a troop that was going to participate in the final battle. Instead, they looked like a ceremonial troop that had come to attend a banquet. The commanders of each troop stood at the front of the formation with their chests puffed up high. All the constructions that Fu Baogua had built during this period of time had long been destroyed. There was nothing left to defend. What was left of Yutong now was only flesh and blood. There was only life left. Then, let us use our lives and blood to build another fortress of resilience that belongs only to Yutong. The trombones sounded passionately. The uniform clopping of hooves could be heard with a rhythm that sent chills down one's spine. Troop after troop of steel cavalry appeared, slowly approaching the left side of the battlefield from the left. Troop after troop of serving troop appeared, approaching the right side of the battlefield from the right. The atmosphere was unusually solemn, the entire battlefield was solemn. My friend has helped me contact Peking Union Medical College Hospital. Line up tomorrow, be hospitalized the day after, and undergo surgery on Monday or Tuesday. Chapter 509. Other than the people, there were also the cavalry's warhorses that came out in formation. For some reason, the warhorses that were usually cheerful seemed to feel the solemn atmosphere today. Even when they were in the midst of such a loud commotion, the warhorses were unusually tame. Amidst the low but passionate singing, all of Yutong's troops, be it infantry or cavalry, went into a conical formation. It was a triangular conical formation. The only purpose of such a formation was to attack. It was a formation that could not defend and only attack. It was a formation that would only be used when facing an enemy that was a few times larger than one's own. At the same time, it was the most extreme and most decisive formation. Among the steel horsemen, 12 youngsters were exceptionally eye-catching. They were also lined up neatly in a row. There was not the slightest bit of hesitation or confusion on their young faces, only determination. These youths were the children from the small valley where Yunyang had been recuperating the other day. All of them were there, not a single one missing. Shengguan Lingxiu, Qiu Jianhan, and Fu Baogua had solemnly told them to take good care of them and protect them as much as possible. In fact, they were included in the troop that was retreating this time, but when they left, even the steel cavalry's leader had asked them to retreat, repeatedly stating that they were Yutong's future hope. It was not cowardice to retreat now, nor was it cowardice. However, no matter how much they tried to persuade them, the 12 youths refused to leave. Since we're men, we should fight for the country. This is a time of crisis for the country. If we valued our lives, we wouldn't have come. We're here to kill the enemy and serve the country, not to be taken care of. If you must chase us away, we'll form our own team and charge the formation ourselves. We won't leave. We've decided to stay here and die here. The 12 youths spoke in unison, their words sonorous and sonorous. Finally, it was Wang Dinghua who made the final decision. They're all good men. Let them stay. Good men and good children. Although there was only a difference of one word, the meaning was as different as heaven and earth. All the men in the military understood the meaning of these words. Towards these few youths, they instantly became more friendly. Previously, they had taken care of and cared for these youths and even felt a little jealous. A group of half-grown children, what did they know about fighting on the battlefield? Didn't they know that it was a matter of life and death? They had wasted so many good horses and they even needed someone to take care of them. Leaving was the right thing to do. But now, there was only the camaraderie of fellow soldiers, enough to entrust his back to the greatest trust. Now, with the 12 youths accompanying the team to battle, just from their appearance alone, they were already qualified to be iron cavalry. There was not the slightest difference between them and their comrades. They were also prepared to die, ready to fight to the death. They were qualified Yutong soldiers as well, not letting down Yutong's military might. Fu Baogua had changed into a rare set of golden armor and appeared at the center of the army. Perhaps it was heaven's will that the heavens were happy to see Yutong's successful battle, as the snow that had been falling for days finally stopped. Under the sunlight that had not shone for a long time, Fu Baogua's golden helmet and armor shimmered like a deity, his aura unparalleled. War drums? Fu Baogua waved his hand and ordered calmly. Dong? The dull sound of a drum suddenly rang out, spreading far and wide. Then dong, 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 another 3 drumbeats rang out. Dong, 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 dong. It was only then that the continuous beating of the war drums rang out continuously. The drumbeats were like a dull pounding on one's heart, causing the blood in one's chest to heat up and surge along with the drumbeats until it boiled. As the drumbeats grew louder and louder, each of Yutong's soldiers' faces seemed to glow. They were still motionless, but their hands that were gripping their weapons tightened gradually, their grip on the weapons becoming steadier. Although all the war horses were unusually quiet and motionless, each of them had their ears perked up, their muscles tensed up. They did not even make the subconscious movement of wagging their tails. The only movement they made was to keep their eyes forward, waiting for their master's order before they turned into an arrow that had left the bow and headed for the final battlefield. On the opposite side, the shadow cavalry surged forward slowly like a tidal wave. Dongshuan soldiers' sabers and spears shone brightly, their murderous aura soaring to the sky. Obviously, Zhang Gu had also adopted the most extreme and forceful method to face the enemy head-on. If you want to court death, I shall fulfill your wish. I shall use my strongest combat power, my comprehensive combat power that far surpasses yours, to crush your final counterattack. This is also the greatest respect I can give to my opponent. Perhaps, this was the greatest respect that could ever be given in this world. Dong dong dong, drumbeats rang out from Dongshuan's side as well. Almost at the same time, a loud neigh of a warhorse rang out from Dongshuan's formation, followed by the sound of galloping hooves. A majestic white horse galloped out. The person sitting on the horse was clad in golden armor like Fu Baogua, looking majestic. He galloped all the way to the front of the two armies and suddenly hollered, "Fu Baogua." The person was Dongshuan's temporary marshal, Zhang Gu. He had actually come to the front of the formation personally. On the other side, Fu Baogua sat on the horse's back, his hawk-like gaze fixed on Zhang Gu, but he did not answer. Under the gaze of tens of thousands of people from both sides, Zhang Gu spoke loudly, "Fu Baogua, you and I have been fighting until now. Although we have our own standpoints, fighting to the death for our respective masters, this battlefield is also where the greatest glory lies. You and I know very well that today is the last battle between both sides. You and I both know that today is the last battle between the two sides. Zhang Gu has specially come here to pay his respects to General Fu and to send him off." Then Zhang Gu waved his hand and hollered, "Wine?" Two riders came out from Dongshuan's formation to deliver the wine pouch. Zhang Gu took the wine pouch and took out a wine cup. He personally filled the cup and raised his hand. "Marshal Fu, regardless of who wins or loses this battle, it is still a matter for the future. However, it is the duty of a soldier to fight to the death on the battlefield. Let me give you a toast and a toast to myself as well. If I die at the end of this battle, I have no complaints. If I die, please, if there's a next life, let's be a bosom friend." As he finished, Zhang Gu tipped his head back and drained the wine in his hand. Zhang Gu finished the 3 goblets in a row and wiped his mouth, speaking loudly again, "I know you're not willing to come out and drink this goblet with me, so I'll drink it myself. These 3 goblets of wine before this life and death battle are delightful, delightful. Ah." Coming out like this and toasting in such a manner, it showed the true nature of a soldier who was fearless of life and death. It also showed his magnanimity. Whether Zhang Ji's move was sincere or not, it was a beautiful move. There was another result to this, or rather, the biggest goal of Zhang Ji's move was to weaken Yutang's already brimming morale as much as possible, and at the same time, boost Dongshuan's morale with the confidence that they would win this battle. A fleeting glint of glee flashed across Zhang Ji's eyes. Han Sanhe watched from afar and could not help sighing. Both sides were on opposite ends of the spectrum. What was the point of playing these little tricks now that they had come to this juncture? Did you think Fu Baogua would let you off easy? Playing tricks in front of an expert like this would only be a futile effort, one that might even bring about one's own destruction. The reality was exactly as Han Sanhe had predicted. On Yutang's side, Fu Baogua's voice boomed like thunder. "Zhang Gu, this marshal has no interest in the 3 goblets of wine that you've come to offer. I don't agree with what you've said just now at all. I have a few words in my heart that I have to say." Zhang Gu said, "Please speak, Marshal Fu." What he wanted to do and what he wanted to say just now had all been said and done smoothly. Fu Baogua had not interrupted him at all. Now that Fu Baogua wanted to speak, if he were to interrupt him, he would appear to lack the demeanor of a general and shatter the confident atmosphere of victory that he had just built. At the very least, the effect would be greatly reduced. Fu Baogua guffawed. "Zhang Gu, you said just now that we each have our standpoints, we each serve our respective masters and we have no choice but to fight. I don't deny the first half of this, we do indeed serve our respective masters and standpoints. However, the latter part, we have no choice but to fight, I find it hard to agree with it." Chapter 510. Fu Baogua's voice was thick and strong, echoing above the battlefield. "Who are you people? What is your purpose in invading Yutang? To put it simply, you are invaders who have come to invade Yutang's great land. We, the soldiers who guard the border, are passively defending. We are the ones who have no choice but to fight. Only we have the right to use the words no choice but to fight. What right do you invaders have to say that you have no choice but to fight? As the saying goes, justice is in the hearts of the people. There is no distinction between right and wrong. What do you say that you have no choice but to fight is nonsense or perhaps a great joke? It's better that you hide quickly and don't make others laugh at you." Fu Baogua's words were sonorous, his voice like a thunderclap as he spoke vehemently. "You said that dying on the battlefield is the duty of a soldier. This, at its core, is understandable, but what do you all die on the battlefield for? For glory and wealth, but we die on the battlefield to protect our homes and defend our country against the invaders. Speaking of which, you are still not worthy of mentioning the word soldier's duty. The so-called greatest glory has nothing to do with you. Zhang Ji's expression changed. You also said that if you die on the battlefield, you have no complaints. If I die on the battlefield, I hope that we can be bosom friends in our next life. Fu Baogua sneered. Let me give you a piece of advice. Keep your words to yourself and stop dreaming. Even if we die on the battlefield, even if there is a next life, we will never be bosom friends with you, the leader of the invaders. Be it life or death, be it this life or the next, you invaders will always be our greatest enemy. If there is a next life, I will only continue to enlist in the army and climb up the ranks to become the marshal again. I will fight you all on the battlefield again to fight to the death. We Yutang soldiers have never been afraid of battle, but we have never been willing to initiate a war. Fu Baogua said loudly, if you had not come, many of us would not have enlisted in the army. If you had not come, many of us would have preferred to stay at home, to live with our wives and children, to farm and cultivate, to grow old together, to unite with our neighbors, to be filial to the elderly, to teach our children. We were willing to be mediocre for the rest of our lives, willing to die of old age in the forest, unknown but peaceful and happy. But you have come, you invaders have come. We have no choice but to fight. If we don't fight, our homes will be destroyed. Our fathers, mothers, wives, and children will be killed. All of us will be enslaved. That's why we are standing here, fighting against you invaders. Now, in order to raise your morale, you actually say such shameless words. What is the greatest honor of a soldier? Coming from your mouth, it will only tarnish the duty of a soldier. Dongxian is not worthy of mentioning the so-called highest honor of a soldier. At this time and place, only we, the Yutang army, deserve to have it. This is ours. Fu Baogua hollered. Yutang's 100,000-strong army was flushed with agitation, feeling like their hearts were about to explode from the gushing blood. They could not help shouting in unison, ours? The orderly and resolute voices were like thunder in the clear sky, shaking the 9 heavens. Zhang Ji's expression changed, and his pupils contracted rapidly. At this moment he realized that he had failed. Not only did Yutang's morale, which had just been knocked down, recover after Fu Baogua's words, it was even several times stronger than before. On the other hand, many of his men had their heads lowered, shame that came from the bottom of their hearts on their faces. Zhang Gu could not help groaning inwardly. He had not expected Fu Baogua to not only be a cut above the rest in the art of war and strategy, but also to be so eloquent. His tongue was as sharp as a knife, and his words were sharp enough to draw blood. Zhang Gu was afraid that he had really outsmarted himself this time. Just as he was about to interrupt Fu Baogua, he heard Fu Baogua roar fiercely again, "There's only one sentence in your long speech that's right. You said that I'm not willing to come out and drink these 3 goblets of wine with you. You're right. I'm not willing. This Fu also drinks, but this Fu only drinks with friends, brothers, and fellow comrades. However, I, Fu Baogua, will never drink with an invader. Are you worthy to drink with me?" Fu Baogua guffawed, his voice like thunder. "Who do you think you are? You're only an invader who has come to invade my land, to invade my home, to kill my brothers, to maim my comrades. How dare you dream of drinking with me? Do you think you're worthy?" Zhang Gu was trembling with rage when he heard him, hollering, "Fu Baogua." Fu Baogua ignored him and recited, "The hearts of Yutang's warriors, the bones of steel to fight against the nation. Today, when the nation is in danger, we won't hesitate to die." He hollered, "Beat the drums. Sound the bugles." The majestic war drums rang with Fu Baogua's command. The bleak and desolate bugles seemed to have blown open the gates of hell as a boundless, menacing aura filled the air and engulfed the heaven and earth. Yutang's warriors, whose blood was already boiling to its boiling point, roared in unison, "Kill!" The sound of horse hooves rumbled like rolling thunder. There were 8 squads of cavalrymen, each of them holding a huge flag high as they charged forward like a raging dragon clearing a path. Wang Dinghua was in the center of the formation as he hollered, "The steel cavalry is here, who dares to invade our land?" Behind him, tens of thousands of steel cavalry responded in unison, "The steel cavalry is here. Who dares to invade our land?" Tens of thousands of people responded in unison, as if a hole had suddenly collapsed in the clear sky. "Serving troop. Since we've enlisted, we shall serve our country with loyalty. Blood shall be shed on the battlefield at the border, we shall not let down our youth. Today we shall serve our country with our lives. Kill? 100,000 soldiers charged forward like a tsunami, determined to fight to the death. Their target was Dongxuan's base. Their aura was unparalleled as they looked down on the world. The military flag fluttered in the wind. Fu Baogua stood at the back of Yutong's army, standing tall like a mountain, his aura imposing. His eyes were glued to the flag that was about to charge into the enemy's base and was gradually blurring, as if he was looking at his next life. He stood tall like a mountain, steady like an abyss, but his vision was already blurry. On the opposite side, the shadow cavalry had already moved out. Like a black wave, they surged from the horizon and rolled forward, blanketing the sky and earth. In an instant they had already covered half of the battlefield, blocking their path. Extremes against extremes, the two armies had launched into a life-and-death battle the moment they came into contact. From this moment on, the final battle of Yutong's eastern front line had begun. Good brother. Good man. We shall continue to fight together in our next life. I, Fu Baogua, shall still be your marshal. Fu Baogua squeezed his warhorse with both legs and pointed the sword in his hand forward. Just as he was about to urge his horse forward with a roar, his body, which was already charging forward, suddenly jerked and stiffened, inexplicably stopping its charge. At the same time, his eyes revealed a peculiar look of disbelief. Han Sanhe, who had been guarding the rear, felt it too. He stood up abruptly, his face ashen and unusually grim. It was at this moment that the whistling wind in the air suddenly changed direction from the northern wind that was in accordance with the weather, turning into a strong western wind. At this moment, the changes in the weather were sudden and without the slightest sign, and it even went against convention. Moreover, it was intense to the point it was unbelievable. The sudden violent western wind swept the ground, bringing with it a cloud of dust and sand as it hurled towards the east. Yes, it was hurled over. At this very moment, the wind swept the sand and dust over. The violent wind howled, hissing in the air. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into an even more powerful hurricane. Gradually, it was no longer limited to sweeping the sand and dust, but it had also swept up the dust, snow and ice on the ground. For a moment, the wind was like a hidden weapon descending from the sky, crashing towards Dongxuan's army along with the wind's momentum. At the same time, the wind and clouds gathered in the sky, gathering above the battlefield as if they had heard the order to assemble. In just a moment, the clouds were already densely packed, piling up into a thick layer. Above the thick layers of clouds, flashes of lightning could be seen from time to time. It was obvious that a large amount of lightning was brewing above the clouds. After a few breaths, the rumbling of thunder reverberated in the sky. The next moment, with a thunderous crack, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky. It was unknown if it was a coincidence or if it was the will of the heavens, but it exploded right in the middle of Dongxuan's shadow cavalry. Chapter 5:11. His recovery was almost complete. In the past few days he would often sit in front of the computer. In the beginning he would feel sore and tear up after looking at it for more than 10 minutes. Now he could basically stay in front of the computer for 40 to 50 minutes before his eyes started to feel sore. Of course, he did not just look at the screen these few days. Naturally, he would also open a document and type a few words. He had rested for 3 to 4 days after his surgery. At that time he really did not dare to look at it. Later on he started to write a few hundred to 1,000 words intermittently every day, cough. Today he actually wrote 2,000 words in one go. Then, his eyes could not take it anymore and he started to tear up. He wrote so few words every day that he could not update normally. But looking at the situation, it would only be 3 to 4 days before he completely recovered. Therefore he decided to start updating next Monday, the 29th. With the 5,000 to 6,000 words that he had written intermittently over the past few days as a foundation, he should not be too tired in the beginning. Therefore there was no need for everyone to worry. After not updating for so long, this was the first time in his 10 years of professional life that he felt as if something was missing in his life. He was finally coming back. Thank you for your concern. This time he was very proud of himself. Although he did not update for nearly 20 days, he basically did not fall behind in his monthly votes. Every time he saw it, he felt a warm feeling in his heart. How could he bear to leave when all of you are so cute? See you on Monday afternoon. Chapter 5:12. If Yutong's eastern frontline's charge was said to be the prelude to this extreme war, then this lightning strike was also the prelude to heaven's might. After the first lightning strike, thick bolts of lightning fell from the sky and landed within Dongxuan's formation. How could the power of heaven and earth be resisted by humans? Men screamed and horses neighed. It was a tragic sight. The power of heaven and earth was unstoppable. Dongxuan's misfortune continued as they endured the natural disaster. Not long after the countless bolts of lightning struck, a charred smell began to spread from the ground. Perhaps it was a dozen breaths later, or perhaps it was only the very next moment. With a deafening explosion, streaks of fire dragons appeared out of thin air and rose abruptly, engulfing the entire Dongxian camp in the blink of an eye. In just the blink of an eye, the dozens of miles of Dongxuan's camp had turned into a sea of fire. The lightning and fire appeared at the same time, their power unstoppable. What was worse was that it was reasonable to say that the ground fire had appeared out of nowhere due to the west wind, burning Dongxuan's base. It was understandable and barely acceptable, but why did the lightning strike from the sky seem to have eyes of its own? It only targeted Dongxuan's soldiers and not a single Yutong soldier perished under the boundless lightning? This was a little too far-fetched. Even a novel would not dare to write something like this. Unfortunately, there was still more to come. With another deafening boom, a huge crack appeared on the ground closer to Dongxuan's formation. It was like the gates of hell had suddenly opened. Countless Dongxian soldiers fell into the crack, caught off guard. Water that came out of nowhere poured in. It was obvious that many of the soldiers who had fallen into the crack were no longer spared. What happened next was the few peaks where Dongxian had set up camp. They collapsed without warning. For a moment, the ground was like a pot of boiling water, constantly churning and tumbling. Both men and horses could not stand and fell. It was a true earth dragon turning over, and it was not just one earth dragon but a few of them at the same time. How could the commotion be insignificant? As far as the eye could see, the ground within a 100-mile radius was rumbling and rumbling. Blood-curdling screams and wails filled the air. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were all screaming in despair. It was the hopeless wail of people on the brink of death. However, the change was not over yet. Streaks of crimson patterns weaved into a huge net in the air and fell with a swoosh. All the Dongxian soldiers who were shrouded in crimson howled in agony without exception. Thin streaks of blood shot out from the pores on their bodies as they died instantly. There were flashes of golden light. The weapons in the hands of countless Dongxian soldiers were sheathed after the flash of golden light. When they landed on their opponents, they would at most injure their tendons and bones. It was difficult to inflict further damage. The difficulty of taking their opponent's life had increased exponentially. All the sabers, swords, spears, and spears had turned into burning sticks made of scrap metal at this moment. These were the signs of Dongxian suffering from natural and earthly disasters, while Yutong was also affected by the phenomenon. Streaks of green light could be seen everywhere in Yutong's army. Yutong's soldiers who were touched by the green light were instantly invigorated, even those who had been severely injured. Most of their injuries were healed and they were brimming with energy, as if they had been resurrected on the spot and were ready to fight again. As far as the eye could see, the sky was covered in layers of clouds that contained lightning and thunder. On the ground, the wind was fueling the fire while the fire bore the might of the wind. It had long turned Dongxuan's orderly troops into a pot of porridge. A pot of mushy porridge. Zhang Gu hollered with all his might, trying his best to recall the army and stabilize their footing. However, the frequent natural and earthly disasters had long surpassed the limits of human control. How could they possibly regroup? By then, Dongxuan's morale had completely collapsed. The wind blew. Fire. Earth dragon. Lightning. Lightning. Water. Blood. Wood. Everything was so familiar. There was only one possibility for such a familiar phenomenon to attack Dongxian but help Yutong. Perhaps it was an explanation. The 9 Supremes. Indeed, the clouds in the sky tumbled violently before 8 huge words appeared. Everyone on the battlefield could see it clearly. It was clear to them, the mighty Yutong, the mighty 9 Supremes. Han Sanhe closed his eyes dejectedly. Was over. The situation that he feared the most had finally happened. Along the way, he had let Zhang Gu be in charge of the main battle. Other than training Zhang Gu so that he, as his successor, could claim all the military merits and obtain the ultimate achievement of defeating Yutong's top young prodigy, there was another concern. Once the 9 Supremes appeared, there would be room to turn things around with him as the backup. However, when the Fortress of Resilience was breached, Supreme Cloud had not appeared. When Qiu Jianhan was on the brink of death and Yutong's elites were trapped, Supreme Cloud had still not appeared. Even when the army had been suppressing Yutong's army, Supreme Cloud had not appeared until now. The outcome was almost certain. Although Han Sanhe's teachings to Zhang Gu were filled with warning and he was even a little pessimistic about the outcome of the battle, Han Sanhe had already come to a conclusion in his heart. Zhang Gu against Fu Baogua, no matter how brutal the battle was, no matter how many casualties Dongxian had to pay, this battle would still be won. Based on the current situation, it could be confirmed that Supreme Cloud had indeed been killed. At the very least he was trapped. Otherwise, it was impossible for him not to appear when Yutong was on the brink of annihilation. He was not fated to participate in this battle. Then everything was simple. No matter how glorious the final outcome of this battle was, only death awaited him when he returned. In that case, it would be better to hand the great merit to Zhang Ji's hands and hasten his rise to fame, grooming the next generation of invincible marshals for Dongxian. Although the consequences for Han Sanhe were unavoidable, Dongxian still had his successor, Zhang Gu, alive and well. His family, children, and descendants would not be too miserable no matter what. The military would always back him up. In spite of this, just as Han Sanhe let down his guard and quietly observed the aftermath of the battle, it was also the most unexpected moment. The power of the 9 Supremes' manifestation powers had appeared once again. Furthermore, this time, it wasn't like the last few times, where there were only 2 or 3 phenomena that appeared. This time, it was like the 9 Supremes' manifestation powers had appeared at the same time to wreak havoc on the battlefield. Almost immediately, all of Dongxuan's troops were dumbfounded. How was this possible? How was this possible? Even if Supreme Cloud was not dead, even if he had come, he should not have been able to create such a terrifying outcome. The manifestations appeared before their eyes, the lightning and fire, the mountains and rivers changing color, the wind and clouds surging, the web of blood, metal and wind. Everything was proof that this was not something that could be done by one person. It was obvious that the 9 Supremes were not dead, not even one of them had died. Moreover, all of them had appeared together. This was how such a situation could be created. Did the 8 words in the sky prove this point, declaring that the 9 Supremes were not dead and had made a comeback at this moment? How was this possible? Dongxuan's soldiers were unwilling to believe that this was true, but everything that they had endured was proof that this was the truth. The 9 Supremes had arrived at the same time in the manifestation of the 9 manifestations. How could there be anyone in this world who could resist them? They were already on the brink of collapse. Even if they were to continue fighting, they would only be sacrificing a few lives for nothing. At this point, it was absolutely impossible to turn the tide of the battle. Defeat was inevitable. Sound the gong, retreat. Han Sanhe closed his eyes helplessly and waved his hand. At this moment all hope was lost. Only those who had personally experienced the power of the 9 Supremes and the 9 manifestations could truly understand its power. Back then, the empire of Deyuan at the southern border had also had the upper hand in terms of military strength, but it could not withstand the combined might of the manifestation powers. It had crumbled with a single touch. Now, the facts had proven that Dongxian was no exception to the rule. The power of the 9 Supremes was indeed the ultimate weapon of war in this world. It was unparalleled. Unlike Dongxuan's despair, Yutong's military formation was the complete opposite. Yutong's warriors could not help but cheer deafeningly at this familiar scene that they had not seen for a long time, especially the sudden sense of bliss. 9 Supremes Lords. 9 Supremes Lords. Deafening cheers rang throughout the battlefield almost instantly. All of Yutong's warriors were guffawing like they had been injected with adrenaline, charging forward with unstoppable momentum. Kill. The 9 Supremes Lords are here. Yutong is saved. We're saved. This is the last battle, but it's Dongxuan's last battle. Yes, 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 victory belongs to us. Kill these invaders. Many of the veterans were so moved that tears streamed down their cheeks. Just when they had resigned themselves to their fate and were ready to fight to the death, the 9 Supremes Lords had finally appeared. Fu Baogua, who had just snapped back to reality and was charging forward, was almost frozen from the ecstasy on his face. Only hot tears were streaming down his cheeks. After some time, he suddenly guffawed, tears still rolling down his cheeks as he roared in a hoarse voice, "Mighty Yutong! Mighty 9 Supremes! Mighty Yutong, mighty 9 Supremes!" Countless people were shouting the slogan with all their might, almost coughing blood from their throats. It was as if they could not vent the extreme happiness and excitement in their hearts if they did not shout like that. Yutong's morale was unstoppable, like a ferocious tiger descending the mountain. Dongxuan's military was dispirited, their morale plunging to freezing point. There was no longer any will to fight. Even the Shadow Cavalry, who was known for their military discipline and was known as the most elite, was in a state of disarray, unable to retaliate. Facing the 9 Supremes at the same time, who would dare say they could resist? That was the true power of heaven and earth. It was not something that a human could fight against. Chapter 513. Fortunately, Han Sanha's signal rang out haphazardly. After a while, it finally became a unified command, bringing some direction to the disorderly morale of the army. Dongxuan's troops turned around and ran back with all their might, retreating like a receding tide. At this point, they could only think of running, to leave the range of the heaven and earth's might as soon as possible. In spite of this, Yutong's morale was high. Chase. Kill. Their only thought was to charge and kill as they gave chase. Zhang Ge still did not want to retreat. The glory of 1,000 years was within his grasp, within his reach. He was about to secure the absolute position of the continent's hegemon. Yet, such a fatal turn of events had happened at this crucial moment. Zhang Ji's head was buzzing. Don't retreat. We have the advantage in numbers. Hold on, hold on. Zhang Ji's eyes were bloodshot. He drew his sword and killed a few of the defeated soldiers personally, trying to control the situation. However, with his strength alone, how could he stop the tens of thousands of soldiers who had already collapsed? Even if he were to kill without stopping, how many people could he kill? The truth was cruel. Not only could Zhang Ge not stop the fleeing soldiers, he was instead surrounded by them, retreating involuntarily. When he came to his senses, he had already retreated all the way out of the fortress of resilience. Where's teacher? Where's teacher? Zhang Ge shouted in a frenzy, looking flustered. In such a critical moment, the only person he could think of was his omnipotent teacher, the god of war Han Sanha. Was a pity? The defeated army was like a landslide. Even if Han Sanha were to step forward personally, he could not change the situation. No matter how elite the troop was, once the morale of the army collapsed and they retreated like this, even if a real deity descended from heaven, he would be helpless, let alone the continent's god of war. Under such circumstances, Han Sanha could gather the defeated soldiers and run in one direction. It was already a feat worthy of a peerless marshal. Yutong's warriors were like ferocious tigers that had just been let out of their cage, chasing after the enemy bravely without letting up. They had been holding back for such a long time. Now was the time for revenge. If he didn't do his best to kill the enemy and take revenge now, when would he? Even a soldier with a broken leg would struggle to find a horse to ride and use all his strength to chase after the enemy. Avenge our fallen brothers. Li Erniu, did you see that? The 9 Supremes Lords are here, we've won, we've avenged you. Bosh Chi, the spirits in the netherworld must be overjoyed. Revenge. Kill them all? Kill all these invaders. Yutong will not allow enemies to wreak havoc. Those who invade Yutong shall be killed, no matter how strong they are. Fu Baogua commanded the troops to give the order to pursue and kill them. Chase after them. Chase them until they're all dead. Honestly, Fu Baogua did not want to pursue her so thoroughly. Fu Baogua understood this better than anyone else. This was a great taboo for commanders and generals and a great taboo for strategists. Although Dong Xian was defeated now with Han Sanha and Zhang Ji's abilities, it would not take long for them to rebuild their army, perhaps with just a place to settle down. Although the army was temporarily routed, it did not mean that it would be routed forever. If they were to be bitten back, it would cause a change in the favorable situation. In spite of this, Fu Baogua had to give chase now. He had already realized that something was not right with the situation. The 9 Supremes' power had only been unleashed once just now. The unstoppable force was unparalleled, but it seemed like each of them had only attacked once. After that, there had been no more movements, as if the 9 Supremes had stopped. This was not a situation that should have happened. Although the advantage of both sides had been reversed, Dongxuan's losses were still limited and their foundation was still intact. As long as they cleaned up the defeated soldiers and regrouped, the situation would change once again. Therefore, the 9 Supremes should continue to unleash their manifestation powers to assist Yutong and secure their victory. Therefore, Fu Baogua immediately realized that the 9 Supremes' power would only have this one chance to attack. Could it be that something really happened? The 9 Supremes had not made a move previously because of some reason. Now that they were in a precarious situation, they were finally forced to make a move, but even if they did, it would be as far as they could go. If that was the case, then they could only continue chasing and fighting. They had to maximize the results of this battle as much as they could. They had to extend the time that Han Sanha had the chance to catch his breath. If his guess was right, Yutong's disaster would still come once Han Sanha had the time to catch his breath. The danger might even be greater than before. Yutong's troops' morale was at its peak now, it was time to push on. If they were to slow down, they would fall into a stage of exhaustion. If Dong Xian were to retaliate, Yutong would suffer a great defeat immediately and their combat power would be diminished due to the interference of various negative emotions. The final outcome would not even be as good as when the soldiers fought to their deaths. After all, it was difficult to have the thought of fighting for their lives now that there was hope. How could a person's emotions change drastically again and again? Especially now that the fortress of resilience was gone. With this natural defense line gone, it would take at least a year to rebuild it. At this moment, a deafening neigh could be heard as a red silhouette sprang up from Yutong's troop like a bolt of lightning. Riding on the red silhouette was a purple silhouette. The man and the horse were as one as they sped towards the direction where Dongxuan's retreating troop was at a breakneck speed. Han Sanhe, give me your life. Fu Baoguo was shocked. Yin Yang? How could it be him? Why was he here? Had he not left with the old marshal and the others? What was going on? Before he could figure it out, the red silhouette had already sped away, vanishing from sight. Dongxuan's troops were still retreating, running back like the tide. Although Zhang Gu had killed many of the retreating soldiers in hopes of stabilizing the situation and stabilizing the troops' morale, it was a pity that human strength was insignificant before the apocalyptic force of heaven and earth. Not only was he unable to turn the tide, he was even swept away by the countless retreating soldiers. Fortunately, Zhang Gu was unable to stabilize the troops' morale, but Dong Xin still had a stabilizing force. On the other side of Dongxuan's camp, a huge flag was erected. This flag looked extraordinary at first glance. Just the surface of the flag alone was about 10 times the size of an ordinary flag. It must be extraordinary. All the Dongxian soldiers who were retreating were charging forward with their heads lowered, hoping to be a step closer to safety and leave the area covered by the terrifying force of heaven as soon as possible. However, there were those who lifted their heads occasionally, and those who did would see the war flag that was more than 300 feet tall, appearing in the sky in front of them like a red cloud. Anyone who saw it would feel their heart calm down inexplicably. The God of War's flag. It was the God of War's flag, Han Sanhe's personal flag. The 8 golden words on the flag shone brilliantly. The strong wind blew the flag until it was as straight as a line, as if it was embedded in the air, detached from the world. 8 words were written on the flag. A sword light that chills the mountains and rivers. Han Sanhe. The main reason why Dongxuan's soldiers were defeated was due to the sudden appearance of the force of heaven and earth. It was unstoppable and unstoppable, but a large part of it was due to the incompetence of the current leader. Zhang Gu could not win against Fu Baoguo in terms of words at the beginning of the battle. Not only did he lose his morale, he had even lost his status. The troops' morale was no longer just restless, it was rather lethargic. If they could gain the upper hand in this battle and fight with the wind, it would be fine. However, now that the entire line had failed and they were completely routed, how could the troops' morale remain? Chapter 5:14. Dongxuan's soldiers did not trust Zhang Gu at all. Now that they were defeated, survival was their top priority. However, Han Sanhe's appearance had given them hope. The war was dangerous and they were at a disadvantage, but it would be better to gather by the continent's God of War's side. The title of the continent's God of War was not just for show. As the flag of the God of War fluttered in the wind, a series of bugles rumbled beneath the flag. On the other side, there were 5,000 Shadow Knights who had just formed into an army. Although they still looked a little disheveled, they had already formed a battle formation. Facing the hundreds of thousands of fleeing soldiers, they did not move an inch. They wanted to turn the tide and were ready to go. As time went on, the blare of the horns gradually merged into one, boosting the morale of the army. Among Dongxuan's men who had gathered, Han Sanhe rode on a warhorse at the front, wearing a snow-white marten coat. His gaze was calm as he watched his troops flee in disarray, his expression unchanging. There was only one message being conveyed by the incessant blare of the horns: return. Gather the troops. Fall into formation. The current quiet atmosphere restored Dongxuan's morale to all the routed soldiers who had witnessed the scene. After all, these troops were Dongxuan's elite troop, the cream of the crop. Dongxuan's cannon fodder, rabble, and aristocratic martial prowess that had invaded Yutong this time had been filled by Han Sanhe to fill the gap of flesh and blood in front of the fortress of resilience. The remaining Dongxian soldiers were warriors who had gone through countless battles of steel and blood. Even if such an elite troop was in a state of defeat due to some unusual factors, as long as there was something that could shock them, they would be able to recover swiftly. Han Sanhe was the one who was able to shock them to their core. More and more soldiers stopped in their tracks, their initially fearful gazes regaining their clarity after a momentary flicker. One by one they stepped forward and joined Dong Xuan's troop, getting into formation. Some of the lower-ranking officers had even begun to reorganize their troops. 5th Battalion, 7th Squad, 3rd Column. Gather here. 3rd Battalion, 1st Column, 2nd Squad. Here. F***CK hurry up. Gather? Stop running. Come and gather. The moment Han Sanha raised the flag of God of War and revealed himself so casually, he managed to quell the fear and panic of the million-strong army. More and more Dongxian soldiers began to line up behind Han Sanha. An awe-inspiring aura that belonged solely to soldier was brewing again. This was where Han Sanha's brilliance came from. He was well aware of his own strengths and weaknesses. It was true that he was known as the continent's God of War, but he was not a true immortal. Even if he had flashed the flag of God of War, it would have been futile. There was a 99% chance that he would follow in Zhang Ji's footsteps and be scattered by the routed army. That would have been a massive defeat and there would be no turning back. Therefore he took the first step and waited at the place where the army had retreated 100 miles, raising his military flag. Given the current situation, the routed army had to be given a buffer. It was only at such a time when the stamina of the routed army that had been running for their lives was almost depleted. Most importantly, the fear of the unknown force was almost numb to them and they needed someone to rely on, a pillar of support. Only then could Han Sanha's sudden appearance achieve such a stunning effect. This logic sounded simple, but under such circumstances, there were at most 3 people in the entire continent who were able to stand out and forcefully stop the defeated army from falling to the ground. In the entire continent there were at most 3 people who could do this. In order to achieve this, the commander-in-chief must have the ability to remain calm in the face of danger and have unparalleled prestige in the army. Neither of these 2 qualities could be lacking. It was truly a feat that could not be accomplished by ordinary people. Dongxuan's routed army surged like the tide. Looking from afar, Han Sanha's side was like a pillar of support amidst the raging waves, a pillar of stability. The routed army was like a raging tide, but when it passed by Han Sanha, the pillar of stability, it quickly turned from a torrent to a slow stream before it stopped and regained its momentum. It was nothing short of a miracle. This was what it meant to be able to turn the tide. Zhang Gu retreated with the routed army, almost coughing blood along the way. When they finally came close and slowed down, Zhang Gu still wanted to draw his sword to slash and suppress the routed army, but he realized that the speed at which the soldiers around him were fleeing had slowed to a crawl. Perhaps, it should be said that they were no longer fleeing but advancing slowly. Zhang Gu sucked in a deep breath and looked over. Once he saw the solemn military formation, tears fell from Zhang Ji's eyes. He choked, "Teacher." Han Sanha remained silent and unmoving, his gaze calm as he waved his hand lightly. Zhang Gu felt his body brimming with energy as he strode over. In just a few steps he had regained his composure. When he came to stand beside Han Sanha, he was completely composed. Even the dejection of his defeat had vanished without a trace. Even if the sky were to fall, everything would be fine as long as his teacher was here. The continent's God of War was the only one who respected his teacher. With his teacher here, so what if the 9 Supremes were to come together? Dust billowed from afar. Han Sanha narrowed his eyes, looking at where the smoke was rising into the sky, and said faintly, "That's where the only chance to turn the tide of this battle lies. Zhang Gu, remember this. This is the last chance that I can teach you and allow you to learn from me." Zhang Ji's face was filled with sorrow. "Yes. Watch closely." There was no expression on Han Sanha's face, only endless indifference. His gaze was distant as he looked into the distance. Fleeing is the most humiliating thing in a general's life, but it's something that can't be avoided. Once it happens, it's the worst-case scenario in a general's life. However, nothing is absolute in this world. Even when the crisis is right before your eyes and you're in a hopeless situation, there's still a chance to turn things around. As long as you don't panic and still have the prestige of stabilizing the army's morale, you can seize the opportunity to turn the tide of the battle. Even if it doesn't work out, you can still retreat in one piece and not suffer a crushing defeat. The current state of the battle has been reversed. The enemy has gained the upper hand, but it's not yet a victory. If the enemy's general is greedy for victory and doesn't know that he's going to lose, he's going to pursue us with all his might, causing his attack formation to fall into disarray. Then we might still have a chance to turn the tide of the battle. Han Sanha said faintly, "Let's see if Fu Baogua can still maintain his composure at such a time. If he can, his position as Qinshuan's God of War will be secured and we can retreat in one piece. On the other hand, if he can't, we'll charge back tonight." There's a huge disparity in our military strength. Even though our army has just been defeated, our combined combat power is still above Yutong's eastern troop. Zhang Gu answered humbly and seriously, yes. What I said isn't only for Fu Baogua. It's the same for anyone you're facing, any general. As a general, remaining calm in the face of danger is the demeanor of a great general. Not wavering even in death. Han Sanha's voice seemed to come from a faraway place as he said, you must remember these words of mine. You can't forget them no matter what, you can't lose your composure. That's why I said that you've disappointed me this time. Han Sanha said solemnly, when the army was defeated, you as the marshal didn't flee first, but you didn't manage to stabilize the army's morale. You couldn't avoid being held hostage by the defeated army. After today's defeat, of course, you should follow the troops, but what you should do is to send your own bodyguards ahead of time with your marshal's flag. Go ahead and raise your marshal's flag on the road that we must pass 60 or even 80 li away. You didn't react as a marshal. Along the way, I've only seen your indignation, your rage, your despair, your violence, and your murder. I didn't see your composure, your unruffled mind despite the defeat. Based on this alone, you're already far from Fu Baogua's level. Han Sanha's gaze was distant. If you can't overcome the fear in your heart, you'll never be able to be a qualified marshal. I hope that the disappointment I feel today ends today. There won't be a next time, never. Yes, this disciple will remember. I won't let you down again. Zhang Gu lowered his head in shame. There were still countless defeated soldiers from Dongshuan's side fleeing for their lives. At the same time, there was also the thunderous clatter of hooves coming from where the thick smoke was rising. Yutong's cavalry had caught up. Han Sanha listened and chuckled bitterly. The situation that I'm most unhappy about has happened. Fu Baogua isn't greedy for victory, nor is he panicking. The clatter of the hooves is still grand and orderly. Han Sanha shook his head. Turning defeat into victory is only a wild wish now. Zhang Gu looked disappointed. With my understanding of Fu Baogua, it's only reasonable and expected for such a situation to occur. It's alright though. Now let me teach you another lesson. Han Sanha said faintly, this lesson is called, the merciful should never command an army. Chapter 5:15. Before his words echoed in the air, Han Sanha's expression turned cold and ruthless as he raised his right hand lightly. What followed was a series of commands that rang out resolutely behind him. In front of them, the countless fleeing Dongxian soldiers saw that they had regained their footing and were regrouping. It was as if hope had dawned upon them and they were about to return to their troops. However, they were shocked to see tens of thousands of longbows drawn, the arrowheads glinting coldly as they pointed at the sky in front of them. There were many Dongxian soldiers who saw this, but they did not know the purpose of this action and who it was aimed at. Yutong's pursuing troops were still a distance away, they were not even within the range of the arrows. Was this not an aimless shot? Teacher. Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat when he saw the situation. Han Sanha ignored Zhang Ji's call and ordered faintly, release the arrows. Swoosh, 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 countless sharp arrows covered the entire sky in an instant. The arrows that blanketed the sky were not aimless. The fleeing Dongxian soldiers who were still surging forward suffered the sudden rain of arrows almost unprepared, collapsing with cries of agony. With just a single wave of arrows, no less than 10,000 routed soldiers were killed on the spot. They were the last part of Dongshuan's fleeing troops, the link between Dongxian and Yutong's pursuing troops. Han Sanha had cut off this link for the sake of the follow-up battle, like a warrior who had cut off his wrist ruthlessly. The rain of arrows stopped as the thick stench of blood permeated the air. The stench of blood had always been a common occurrence on the battlefield, but the source of such a huge commotion and casualties was their own people. It was inevitable that it was different from the past. The entire Dongxian troop suddenly fell into an unprecedented silence. It was the duty of a soldier to obey orders. It was not that the tens of thousands of archers did not know what they were doing, but since the order was given by their superior, they had to execute it. Although they already had a rough idea of what to do, the reality was still shocking and chilling to the core. Since the tens of thousands of archers were acting this way, the other Dongxian soldiers were even more fearful and doubtful. I know what you want to say, Han Sanha said expressionlessly, it's not too late to wait for them to rejoin the troop. In fact, as long as we mobilize the Shadow Knights that have already been gathered to support them, they will be able to return safely, right? Zhang Gu stared straight ahead at the black mass of corpses of his comrades. The corpses were like porcupines. He felt as if his heart was being cut by a knife. For a moment he actually forgot to reply. But you've forgotten that time waits for no man. Let's not talk about how they're going to deal with Yutong's pursuing troops if they rush over and have no time to get into formation. Han Sanha said coldly. Furthermore, their so-called return will only cause another wave of chaos to the troops that have already formed their combat capabilities. You have to know that at this point in time, even the slightest disturbance will cause a huge impact. We won't have the room to reorganize the troops anymore. At that time, as long as the enemy charges and establishes an advantage, they will be able to trigger the panic from before. At that time, it would truly be a crushing defeat and they would die a graveless death. Han Sanha uttered faintly, battle song? Although Han Sanha's voice was nonchalant, his tone was cold and harsh. Zhang Gu shuddered when he heard him, lifting his head in terror. Teacher. Listen carefully, watch carefully. This is the last time I'm teaching you. Han Sanha said rather ominously, what comes next is another lesson. This time it's called cultivation of aura. Before his words echoed in the air, he waved his hand. Suddenly, a loud roar erupted from the Janissaries. Then, thousands of people roared at the same time. The sound was earth-shattering and deafening. Fight! 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 All the soldiers and steeds, all the soldiers were energized at once. Then a voice hollered, chill with a sword. Mountains and rivers. The voice was unexpectedly majestic and impassioned. 3,000 Janissaries puffed out their chests at the same time, shouting with all their might, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. Another person's voice rang out, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. This time there were more echoes. Chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. It was no longer a call for 100 or 1,000 responses, but tens of thousands of people. Then another voice led the way, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. All the 200,000 Dongshen soldiers who were already in formation chanted in unison, chill with a sword, mountains and rivers. In the end, everyone, be it the injured, the Janissaries or the routed soldiers, roared at the same time, their voices growing more and more uniform, more and more forceful, more and more direct. The flag was waved. The cheering stopped abruptly. However, Zhang Gu could clearly feel the soaring fighting spirit, the invincible aura, coalescing into form amidst these few chants. They were routed soldiers who had just been gathered, but they had formed an aura that was sharper than a dagger in a matter of moments. Zhang Gu even felt a surge of confidence that even if Fu Baoguo were to arrive with his army, he would be able to fight them with such a troop in his hands. There was only awe in Zhang Ji's heart at this moment. Han Sanha's method of reorganizing the army seemed ordinary at most, but to be able to achieve such a feat at a time like this, when they were on the losing end, was truly a miracle. It was unbelievable. On the opposite side, Yutong's cavalry appeared amidst the smoke and dust as expected, their ferocious aura not diminishing at all. Han Sanha squinted and said, the aura has been formed, but it's a pity that the combat power is still incomplete. This is the third lesson I'll teach you and the last lesson I'll teach you in this life. This lesson is called sacrifice. Zhang Ji's heart skipped a beat as he lifted his head to look at Han Sanha and cried out involuntarily, Teacher you? Han Sanha stared at the opposite side with narrowed eyes. A rush of galloping could be heard as a crimson cloud burst out from Yutong's cavalry formation. It took only a few breaths but it had already traversed thousands of feet and arrived before Dongshuan's troop alone. As the crimson cloud arrived, a voice filled with murderous intent rang out, Han Sanha, since you're already here, do you still think you can leave? A tall and majestic crimson steed entered Dongshuan's sight. The red steed was taller than ordinary horses by at least 1.5 heads, and its body was almost 2.5 meters tall. Its entire body was covered in red fur, and it stood there like a burning flame raging endlessly. The pair of horse eyes were filled with intelligence. When their gazes met, Dongshuan's people actually felt a faint sense of disdain. Disdain? This was merely a horse, but it actually gave off the feeling that it did not even consider the 200,000 soldiers in front of it worthy of its attention. It stood there, its red mane floating in the air like flames. It looked at the group as if saying, all of you are trash. On the horse's back, a person stood tall and straight, equally arrogant and disdainful. That handsome and exquisite face made everyone feel ashamed of their own inferiority. His figure was tall and slender like a jade tree in the wind. His purple robe fluttered slightly in the wind but his gaze was like a bolt of lightning, filled with boundless iciness. As he scanned the Dongshen troop in front of him, his gaze focused on Han Sanha. The long saber in the man's hand was still gleaming with a crimson glow. It was a ghastly sight, but there was a hint of a cruel smile on his face. Ha! Han Sanha's chuckle rang out calmly. His eyes were filled with admiration as he looked at Yun Yang and said with a smile, "So it's young Master Yun who has graced us with your presence. It looks like this old and useless one hasn't guessed wrongly. Young Master Yun is no ordinary person indeed." Yun Yang smiled faintly and said, "I'm very pleased to be looked upon so highly by Marshal Han." This time Han Sanha's composure struck Yun Yang as something special and unexpected. Han Sanha could feel Yun Yang's deific sense lingering on him. He could not shake it off no matter what he said under such circumstances. He could not help feeling apprehensive. Other than being the publicly acknowledged god of war, Han Sanha also had considerable cultivation base attainment that was no weaker than old Marshal Chiu or Lung Daoyin. He was already at the pinnacle realm's advanced level. Based on his talent alone, Dongshen might lose a god of war, but it might gain a heaven realm cultivator if he were to devote himself to cultivation. In spite of this, Han Sanha had already circulated his deific consciousness to its maximum, but he still could not break free from Yun Yang's harassment. The only reason was that Yun Yang's cultivation base was far above Han Sanha's and had reached a height that exceeded Han Sanha's knowledge. Han Sanha was not the only one who was shocked. The experts beside him were equally shocked. Chapter 5:16. Han Sanha was speechless. His warhorse was kneeling with its front hooves on the ground, its head lowered like it had committed a crime, like a condemned prisoner. Although Han Sanha was still riding on the horse, his feet were already touching the ground. No matter how calm Han Sanha was in the face of death, he could not help but feel utterly speechless. After a pause, Han Sanha dismounted his warhorse and stood with his arms behind his back. He smiled faintly and said, "Looks like this old man has been blind, and I have been disrespectful. Young Master Yun's horse is actually the legendary king of horses, one that only appears once every 10,000 years. The legend of the king appearing and all horses bowing down to him is true. Young Master Yun is truly blessed. King of horses, this marshal apologizes sincerely for my lack of manners." Yun Yang said sincerely, "Marshal Han, how gracious you are." Han Sanha said faintly, "This is probably the only grace a defeated general has left." He laughed and said in a carefree manner, "As a militant, the greatest fortune is to be born in troubled times and to be able to build one's career. However, in this heavenly world of soldiers, a powerful weapon that shouldn't exist has appeared. It's a gift from the heavens that destroys the balance of everything." Yun Yang nodded in agreement and said, "That's right. Yutong's 9 Supremes, such an existence shouldn't have appeared in this world, nor should it have appeared on the battlefield. The existence of the 9 Supremes is the nightmare of all militants and marshals. It's also the source of their sorrow." Han Sanha sucked in a long breath. No matter how many schemes there are, they can't stand up to the power of nature. In the face of such boundless might, the so-called talent of a commander is nothing but a joke. Han Sanha said faintly, "Actually, the 9 Supremes are not only the sorrow of this old man and the marshals of the 4 empires, they are also the sorrow of Yutong's marshals like Tai Zheng and Fu Baogua. Young Master Yun, do you agree with this?" Yun Yang nodded. "I agree with this argument as well. However, the root of this matter concerns our respective standpoints, so I'm very happy to see such an existence that shouldn't exist in Yutong. The stronger it is, the better. Shouldn't the enemy's nightmare be our Yutong's favorite sight?" Han Sanha guffawed. "Well said. If the 9 Supremes were in Dongshen, this old man would think the same. Of course I wouldn't mind." While both of them were talking, Yutong's troop had arrived as well. They were slightly further away from Han Sanha. The army was majestic, their flags fluttering in the wind. Naturally, Fu Baogua came along as well. Along the way, Fu Baogua dared not be idle at all. He was afraid that Yutong's army would be greedy for victory and their formation would fall into disarray, giving the enemy a chance to counterattack. Otherwise, they would not have arrived at this time. However, Fu Baogua could not help but feel suspicious when he saw the confrontation between the two armies. His military experience told him that there might be a great turning point right before his eyes. Although Yutong's army had the upper hand now, it was not a victory. After all, Dongshuan's military strength was still present and its combined combat power was still far superior to Yutong's eastern troop. Any sudden change could change the tides of the war. He watched as Yun Yang and Han Sanha conversed from afar. Seeing that both of them seemed to be chatting happily, occasionally guffawing, he could not help touching his face and murmuring, "I didn't expect Marquis Yun's young master to have such a relationship with Han Sanha." He's an expert indeed, his actions are unpredictable. Seeing that both of them seemed to be done with their conversation, Fu Baogua galloped out, joining the conversation of the century. Yun Yang did not turn back, his eyes still trained on Han Sanhe as he said with a faint smile, "Our true protagonist, Fu Baogua, is here." An inexplicable cloud flashed across Han Sanhe's eyes, as if all the glory he had in the past had flashed past his eyes at this very moment. Then he straightened his back and continued to place his arms behind his back, looking up at Fu Baogua who was riding over. "Marshal Han, it's been a long time. We meet again." Fu Baogua hopped off his steed and strode over when he was near. Although the two armies were at each other's throats and there was no room for negotiation, everyone in the military would still respect Han Sanhe, the legendary god of war of his generation. Even when they hated him to the core, they still respected him like a deity. Han Sanhe watched Fu Baogua with his arms behind his back. After a long time, admiration shone in his eyes. Fu Baogua has indeed become a pillar of support. Yutang's fortune. I dare not. Marshal Han praises me too much. Fu Baogua said, "The current battle was truly a fluke." Han Sanhe shook his head and said, "How can there be flukes in a war? You, Fu Baogua, are indeed qualified to compete on the battlefield with any famous general in this world. This is an indisputable fact, a reality." Fu Baogua smiled and said seriously, "Luck has always been a part of one's ability, but this luck of mine is really just luck." If Marshal Han had commanded the previous battle personally, Yutang's eastern troop could only win even with the help of the 9 Supreme's lords. It would have been impossible for them to achieve such a result. This is also the truth. Han Sanhe smiled faintly and sighed discreetly. At this point there was no need for modesty anymore. Han Sanhe knew that Fu Baogua was speaking the truth and was speaking from the bottom of his heart. He wanted Zhang Gu to make a name for himself in a single battle, so he had to take the risk. Now that the risk had appeared, the current reality was the reward for failing to take the risk. "I wonder if Marshal Han has anything to say to Baogua by coming personally and waiting here?" asked Fu Baogua. Since he saw Han Sanhe standing here, he had guessed Han Sanhe's intention almost immediately. However, it was because he knew that his respect and admiration for Han Sanhe had involuntarily increased. This was an extremely terrifying enemy, but he was also an opponent worthy of anyone's respect. Han Sanhe smiled and said, "This old and useless one is waiting here of course to talk to Marshal Fu. As the saying goes, it's difficult to have a bosom friend, but it's difficult to have an enemy." "Please enlighten me, Marshal Han," Fu Baogua said respectfully, completely ignoring the sarcasm in Han Sanhe's words. Han Sanhe turned to look at his Dongxian troop. Of course, he would not miss the concerned gazes directed at him. He could not help feeling a pang in his heart as he turned back and said, "I believe Marshal Fu can already tell that after today's battle, Dongxuan's morale has been greatly damaged, but Yutang has lost its natural barrier as well. The unbreakable reputation of the eastern border no longer exists. If we continue to fight, it'll be a devastating scene. I believe that neither of us will be happy to see this." Fu Baogua said calmly, "Yes, Marshal Han is right. However, Yutang's warriors have long disregarded life and death. Our only thought is to protect our home and country. At most, we'll perish together, that's all." Although Fu Baogua's tone was calm, everyone could hear the determination in his words that he would not hesitate to fight. Han Sanhe's tone was still calm and steady. "Our army has been defeated in today's battle, this is a fact. However, I've already regrouped my troops and formed a combat force. If we continue to fight, I'm still confident that both sides will perish together. This is the outcome that Marshal Fu has in mind. However, is Marshal Fu really happy to see this?" Now that Dongxian had been defeated, it was a huge loss. There were less than 300,000 soldiers left and their morale and confidence had dropped to the freezing point. The only reason they could still assemble into an army was because of Han Sanhe's prestige. Yutang was not having an easy time either. The number of people they had left was far less than Dongxuan's and they had expended a great deal of their energy. Morale was important, but they still needed sufficient physical strength and the support of a comprehensive military force. If the battle were to continue and Dongxian was reduced to a wailing army, the outcome would be hard to predict. Even the best outcome for Yutang would be for both sides to perish together. Reality was cruel. It was impossible for Han Sanhe to win and regain the overwhelming advantage he once had, but he knew that it was impossible. However, it was entirely possible for both sides to perish together. Han Sanhe's words were not empty talk. Fu Baogua was well aware of this. After a moment of silence he said, "Marshal Han, you've seen it clearly. However, it's meaningless to do so. It'll only increase the losses of both countries. Han San has said, that's why this old and useless one is waiting here, planning to have a good talk with Marshal Fu. Why don't both countries call a truce now and leave everything for the future? What do you think? Fu Baogua said calmly, I'm listening. Even if it's a truce, there should be details of it, shouldn't there? Han San has said, the current situation is unusual, let's skip over the details. Our men will retreat to the original border of both countries. The Fortress of Resilience will still belong to Yutong. I believe Marshal Fu understands that after Dongshuan's army retreats, they won't be able to attack Yutong for the time being. Both sides can, at least 10 years of breathing time. Isn't Marshal Han thinking too much? Our army has already gained the upper hand and the initiative now. Most importantly, Marshal Han needs to understand that as long as the 9 Supremes Lords show up once more, they can crush the remaining fighting spirit of Dongshuan's 300,000 soldiers. Under such circumstances, we can pursue them with our victory and chase them all the way to Dongshuan's gates, or even march straight in. Chapter 517. Han Sanha chuckled in amusement. Looking at Fu Baogua with a smile, he said faintly, this old man understands as well as Marshal Fu that such a situation will never happen again. Why must Marshal Fu set up an empty fort in front of this old man? Aren't you afraid that this old man will drag Yutong's army down with him in a fit of rage? Fu Baogua could not help but blush as he forced himself to say, Marshal Han, what do you mean by that? Han San has said, if the 9 Supremes still had the strength to strike, the commotion just now wouldn't have ended there, nor would it have lasted for such a short period of time. If the 9 Supremes still had the strength to strike, how could they have given me the chance to reorganize my army? Marshal Fu, about the 9 Supremes, let's not bring it up again. What Han San has said was what Fu Baogua was most worried about. Hearing that Han Sanha had seen through his thoughts, Fu Baogua's expression changed slightly before he said, Marshal Han, you've seen through everything. You're a schemer indeed, your foresight is like a torch. However, according to Marshal Han, are we just going to end this peacefully? Even if Yutong is invaded for no reason and the counterattack is successful, there's no price to pay, is there? If that's the case, does that mean that Yutong's people deserve it? Furthermore, how can I be sure that Marshal Han's promise is true? These days, even the credence of peace can be disregarded. Is a promise really useful? Towards the end, Fu Baogua's tone was laced with sarcasm, pointing directly at the credence of peace that Han Sanha had issued and the matter of him breaking the promise. Han Sanha blushed as well, pausing for a moment before he said, although a promise can be broken due to one's position, some things should still be kept as a guarantee. As long as Marshal Fu agrees to let Dongshuan's 300,000 men leave safely, I, Han Sanha, am willing to commit suicide here and now, using my life to answer to Yutong. Can this old man's life make up for the so-called broken promise? Han Sanha's voice was suddenly louder, loud enough for Dongshuan's people to hear. Behind him, Zhang Gu and the others were enraged. Marshal, you mustn't. Teacher, you mustn't. We haven't lost yet. We'd rather die than make such a compromise. Han Sanha turned around abruptly and said sternly, I'm not dead yet, all of you shut up. His sharp gaze swept across the crowd and he said angrily, don't you know what the situation is right now? Only if all of you survive can Dongshan be preserved. If all of you were to die here, what's the use other than a moment of bravery? I, Han Sanha, am already 70 years old. How many more years can I live even if I'm on my last legs? I've killed countless people in my life, and the number of innocent souls that have died under my orders is in the tens of millions. If I were to pay for it with my body today, it would be a wonderful story. Exchanging my life for the safe return of 300,000 good men, what do I, Han Sanha, have to regret? I have already made up my mind. No one is allowed to dissuade me on this matter. Anyone who dissuades me will be dealt with according to military law. I, Han Sanha, don't wish to behead my comrade before I die. Han Sanha turned resolutely after he finished speaking, not sparing Dongshan another glance. Naturally, he could not see the Dongshan soldiers behind him, all of them tearing up, unable to make a sound. Han Sanha turned to face Fu Baogua again and said calmly, this old man only has this one request, and it's also the biggest price I can pay right now. I wonder if Marshal Fu can fulfill this old man's wish? Han Sanha did not use the word can you promise, but can you fulfill? Although it was only a difference of one word, the meaning behind it was thought-provoking. Fu Baogua understood Han Sanha's good intentions at once and could not help sighing. This renowned marshal who had dominated the continent for decades, an invincible marshal who had paved his path to God of War with mountains of corpses and seas of blood, had finally come to this step. Marshal Han, Fu Bagua sighed, I understand and understand. Am willing to fulfill your wish. He sucked in a breath and said, Marshal Han, as Tianxuan's God of War, you didn't lose to Yutong. You lost to Dongxian not on the battlefield but under Dongxuan's layers of restraint. Therefore your loss doesn't involve the battlefield, you're still the undefeated God of War. The only thing I can do is to fulfill your last wish. Han Sanhe stared at Fu Baogua and said softly, Marshal Fu, it's better if you don't agree so readily. This is a serious matter, and as the person directly involved, you bear the greatest responsibility. Do you think you can shoulder this responsibility? Fu Baogua smiled and said, I know about this of course. However, I don't want to see Marshal Han's ending be too bleak. As a fellow militant, this is the last respect I can give to Marshal Han, to the continent's God of War. Although we're enemies and we stand on opposing sides, I, Fu Baogua, am determined to shoulder this. Fu Baogua's smile was sincere and filled with regret. Han Sanhe stared at him and finally sighed, Fu Baogua, what a talent you are. As a general, daring to take responsibility for what you've done is courage, being decisive in battle is charisma, strategizing is strategy, being clear-minded is wisdom, knowing when to advance or retreat is the way to conduct oneself. Fu Baogua, you're considered a well-rounded talent. Fu Baogua replied calmly, Marshal Han, you flatter me. Han Sanhe sighed softly and suddenly turned to look at Yun Yang, saying softly, Young Master Yun, if anything happens in the future, I hope that young Master Yun can take care of the Han family a little. Yun Yang was taken aback and said, I don't quite understand Marshal Han's words. Yun Yang was not pretending to be knowledgeable. Han Sanhe was Dongxuan's man after all. Was what he had just said a last-minute request? But was it possible to do so? It was impossible. Han Sanhe smiled faintly and said, Young Master Yun doesn't need to understand. Just remember this old man's request. Everything will be clear in the future. Yun Yang frowned and said in deep thought, If so, I'll agree to it. Han Sanhe chuckled and said, Young Master Yun is a noble descendant of heaven. There is no one in this world who can be more blessed than young Master Yun. Since I've agreed to it, it's even more so to show my righteousness. This old man has nothing else to worry about. I have no regrets after this. He cupped his fists and bowed solemnly. Thank you, Marshal Fu. Thank you, young Master Yun, for fulfilling my wish. Before his words echoed in the air, Han Sanhe took a few steps back and turned abruptly. Looking at the worried Dongxian soldiers who were about to dash out, Han Sanhe said loudly, Pass down my order. Yes, sir. Retreat immediately. Don't stop along the way. Head straight for the capital. This war ends here. This order takes effect immediately. Once he finished speaking, he drew his sword with a clang, his resolve clear. Teacher. Zhang Gu was shocked, no longer caring about the military order as he sprinted forward like his life depended on it. The clouds in the sky changed colors as the cold wind howled. Han Sanhe's robes fluttered in the wind as if they were about to be blown away by the wind. He waved his hand lightly, but Zhang Gu stopped in his tracks as if he had been struck by lightning. Tears streamed down his face as he cried out sorrowfully, Teacher. Han Sanhe smiled faintly and recited softly, A lifetime of battles between heaven and earth, a command like a mountain chills the bones of the dead, a year of hunger on the battlefield swallowing snow, unable to return to my homeland even after 10 years, a lifetime of settling the affairs of an emperor, a grand ambition to unite the land. As he recited, he suddenly chuckled sadly and murmured, I can bear to cook the hounds. When the hares are dead, I have no regrets when the birds are dead, I only lament that before the grand ambition is fulfilled, the heart of the emperor and his officials is already cold. I've marched thousands of miles out of the desert, donned 1,000,000 armors and fought fiercely. The demons and monsters have been wiped out, the mountains and rivers can be seen from now on. It's hard to look back on my 7-foot body, this old man's tears are speechless. Today I repay the world with my life, I'll let my corpse return on horseback. Han Sanhe heaved a long sigh and said sternly, Your Majesty. Before he could finish his words, he did not continue. The sword light flashed and blood appeared immediately. Blood gushed out from his neck like a fountain, dyeing the mountains and rivers red. Han Sanhe stood tall with his sword in one hand, unmoving as the two armies clashed against each other. He did not move. The god of war of a generation had left the underworld in this lifetime. Teacher. Zhang Gu howled in pain, suddenly falling to his knees on the ground as if he had lost his soul, tears and snot streaming down his face. Marshal. A deafening cry came from Dongshuan's formation, countless men in the army weeping like rain. Yun Yang and Fu Baogua could not help sighing inwardly as they looked at Han Sanhe's body that was inches away from them. Han Sanhe was still standing tall despite the fact that his breath had stopped and his life had left his body. His expression was still indifferent, his eyes still looking forward as if he was stroking his beard with a smile. The sword in his right hand gleamed coldly, stained with blood. However, the feeling it gave was still that of the god of war of a generation giving orders from the marshal's tent. Chapter 5:18. These few days I only wrote 500 words a day, 1,000 words a day, and sometimes 2,000 to 3,000 words. I've saved up these chapters and I'll publish them all today. Let's enjoy ourselves first. Let's talk about tomorrow. Thank you for your patience and company. Feng Ling is deeply grateful. These days, I think, should be a period of time that I will never forget for the rest of my life. Especially after the surgery, the days when I was blindfolded, it was the most memorable. Just looking at it with one eye, even the phone screen looked blurry. Talking and laughing every day, my heart was anxious. It wasn't easy to remove it, and when I looked at it, my vision was so clear. Don't worry. In the beginning, when the doctor said it was serious, I was also panicking. Ever since I started writing, it has been 10 years and I have never stopped writing for such a long time. Sometimes I would let my imagination run wild, thinking that when Master Xing retired, everyone would say that they owed him a movie ticket. If I, Feng Ling, was really blind, and had no choice but to retire from this industry, who knows how many people would still remember that they once owed an author a subscription fee. Luckily no one. After not writing for more than 20 days, I'm back. Since I'm back, I'll continue to work hard and do my own thing. During this period of time, my brothers and sisters have been worrying about me, supporting me, and the managers have all sent screenshots to me. Some asked anxiously, some directly went to the hospital from thousands of miles away, and many brothers and sisters sent nourishment products. To be able to meet all of you in this life, it's my great happiness. How can I give up this happiness so easily? I've also thought that since I have 7 or 8 chapters in stock, I might as well slowly publish it and rest more. But thinking about it, everyone is so good to me, why should I hold on to it? I might as well publish it all and let everyone enjoy it. I'll talk about the future in the future. In short, I'm back. My eyes haven't recovered yet, and in the next 3 to 6 months, I'll try to avoid washing my face. I can't drink or eat spicy food. I'll take note. Maybe after today's explosion, there will be fewer updates in the future. But I'll try my best to write. When the time comes, I hope everyone can understand and understand. Thank you. My dear brothers and sisters, it's so good to stand side by side with all of you in this world again. Chapter 5:19. Dongshuan's cries were deafening. Fu Baogua and Yun Yang bowed respectfully at Han Sanhe's body that was still standing upright and retreated slowly. This continent's god of war had spent his entire life fighting the world and had caused immense pain to Yutong's people. However, they had different standpoints and had practiced war. They served their own masters. There was no right or wrong. Whether it was Yun Yang or Fu Baogua, they had to acknowledge this man's lifetime of achievements with a sense of melancholy. No matter what, this was a qualified soldier. A qualified marshal. Rest in peace. Yun Yang said softly, if there's a next life, we shall fight again. Fu Baogua heaved a long sigh. Her gaze towards Yun Yang was filled with gentleness. No matter what, there were not many people who could understand a pure military man like Han Sanhe. Yun Yang's words were not only an acknowledgement of Han Sanhe, but also the greatest understanding of the continent's militants. If there was a next life, they would fight again. Fu Baogua. Zhang Gu hollered, jumping up like a madman, his eyes bloodshot. It's you who forced my teacher to his death. Do you want to leave just like that? Fu Baogua stood still and turned to speak coldly. You and I both know the reason for Marshal Han's death and we are well aware of it. Zhang Gu, I know you're upset, but if you intend to go against Marshal Han's dying wish and insist on fighting, I, Fu Baogua, and 200,000 Yutong men will fight with you. There's no need to use such a lame excuse. Zhang Gu trembled when he heard him, glaring at Fu Baogua as if he wanted to devour him. After a long time, his gaze returned to Han Sanhe. After a long time, Zhang Gu roared, yes, Marshal. Retreat. Dongshuan's army, retreat. As soon as he finished, Zhang Gu spat a mouthful of blood. His muscular body fell to the ground, facing the sky. After that, Dongxuan's army only stayed for half a day before they began to retreat slowly. When they retreated, the entire army was already dressed in plain mourning, white banners covering the sky. All the soldiers were silently shedding tears as they quietly walked back. The gloomy atmosphere along the way was startling to see. No one could doubt what kind of astonishing emotions were brewing in the chest cavity of this kind of troop, but they were forcefully suppressing them to not erupt. Before they left, all the Dongxian soldiers turned to look in Yutong's direction. Their wolf-like gazes made one's heart sink. Despite the high morale of Yutong's soldiers, they were inexplicably shocked. No matter what, Dongxuan's troops had retreated. The battle of the century between Yutong and Dongxian had finally come to an end. Yutong had won after all. We won. We won. All of Yutong's soldiers cheered. For a moment, the ecstatic cheers shook the clouds. Yun Yang and Fu Baogua stood side by side on their horses, watching Dongxuan's army that was slowly leaving and getting further away. There was no trace of joy on their faces. Even when they heard the deafening cheers of their own soldiers, they remained silent. It wasn't that the two of them didn't feel relaxed, but at the same time, they also felt an indescribable melancholy. The god of war had fallen just like that. He had committed suicide in front of two armies. He had used his life in exchange for the safe return of 200,000 to 300,000 soldiers and the continuation of the Han family's glory. He had even used his death to preserve a large amount of energy for Dongxian and a buffer time that was sufficient for them to recuperate. Furthermore, the ruler had obtained the space to expand his regime without any hindrance. Just like what Fu Baogua had said, Han Sanhe had not lost to Yutong nor to the Nine Supremes. He had only lost to Dongxuan's imperial court. The only thing worth rejoicing about was that his way home was on the battlefield, and he wouldn't be trampled by those political clowns. I didn't expect the god of war to end like this. Fu Baogua's mood was downcast. As an enemy, Han Sanhe was undoubtedly the person he hated the most. This was because the damage this person had done to Yutong and to the continent situation had almost reached a height that was unparalleled throughout the ages. However, from a military standpoint, Han Sanhe was also the person Fu Baogua admired the most. Throughout the 5,000 years of Tianquan's militarism, Han Sanhe's achievements in military affairs could only be described with 8 words: unprecedented and unparalleled. An absolute god of war. Unshakable and unparalleled, unprecedented and unparalleled. Yun Yang sighed faintly and said, "Actually, Marshal Fu might not have noticed that there was a deeper meaning behind Han Sanhe's expedition this time. Perhaps he never planned to return from the beginning. Whether he won or lost this war, whether he lived or died, Han Sanhe had already decided not to return to Dongxian." Fu Baogua thought about Yun Yang's sudden statement for a long time and said, "I understand half of it. As for the other half, please enlighten me, young Master Yun." Yun Yang said, "Perhaps Han Sanhe didn't think that he would die when he first deployed his troops. On one hand, he wanted to nurture his domestic forces and ensure that there would be no gaps in Dongxuan's military higher-ups. On the other hand, he wanted to conquer half of Yutong as his backyard and his biggest political leverage. The purpose of this can be said to be obvious. As long as he succeeds, even if he survives, as long as he has half of Yutong in his hands, Han Sanhe will have no worries even if he has to face the whole of Dongxian. On the other hand, if he fails, there's no way out. There's really no need for him to continue living. It's just a matter of dying earlier or later." Yun Yang analyzed calmly, "According to our intelligence, Han Sanhe's situation in the nation of Dongxian isn't looking good. He's basically surrounded by enemies on all sides. Furthermore, he's used this war and the pressure of the nation's righteousness to send all the private armed forces of Dongxuan's aristocratic families into the battlefield. Han Sanhe's ruthlessness doesn't stop there. His true cruelty lies in the fact that he's conscripted all these armed forces and sent them all to the Fortress of Resilience. There's a total of 700,000 of them. During this period of time, Dongxian has attacked the Fortress of Resilience with all its might, regardless of the cost and casualties. Actually, Marshal Fu, what you're facing are only the private troops commanded by Han Sanhe, not Han Sanhe's elite troops. There's a decisive difference between the two." Yun Yang said faintly. "Han Sanhe has actually cooperated with you, Marshal Fu. It's all because of your intentional and unintentional cooperation that Dongxuan's malignant armed forces are sent to their graves. Almost 1 million private troops have been killed just like that. The nation of Dongxian is basically in peace now. Even if there's still some left, it won't affect the overall situation. As long as Dongxuan's emperor isn't a muddle-headed bastard. Therefore, Han Sanhe's greatest contribution, the one that's least acknowledged, is here." Fu Baoguo was hit with a sudden realization. I see. After a while he murmured, no wonder, no wonder. When I evaluated the combat power of both sides, the conclusion I came up with was that I could only hold on for a while before Han Sanhe broke through. However, the truth is far more optimistic than my estimation. I've held on for more than twice the amount of time. If not for this extra buffer time, Yutang's chances of losing this war would have increased by at least 50%. I've thought of many things before this. I've thought about the help of Marquis Yun, I've thought about the efforts of other reinforcements, but the only thing I didn't think about was Dongxuan's internal support. Life is like a game of chess indeed, the universe is unpredictable. Therefore, all of Dongxuan's nobles, including the royals, hate Han Sanhe to the core. If this war is lost, only death awaits Han Sanhe when he returns. He's already in an awkward situation where he can't advance or retreat. No matter if he advances or retreats, it's a path to hell. Furthermore, if Han Sanhe returns to Dongxian alive, Dongxuan's military will be suppressed to the point where they can't even lift their heads due to this defeat. For a long time to come, Dongxuan's military will be at an absolute disadvantage in the imperial court. Militants are the worst at dealing with situations where they're in the wrong. They'll only be beaten up passively without any room to turn things around. If that happens, Dongxian will lose its god of war and its military power. How could it be fortunate that its military won't be able to recover? Even if the nobles see this, they won't give up on their own benefits. They've only ever had benefits in their eyes, there's no such thing as morality. If that happens, Dongxian will truly be finished. Yun Yang said in admiration, but the situation now is completely different. Han Sanhe's dead. The source of Dongxuan's defeat and conflict has used his death to atone for his sins. He died for the lives of 300,000 soldiers and Dongxuan's national destiny. He used his death to turn the tables on this terrible situation. Han Sanhe's death has turned the nation's military into a mourning army. Mourning soldiers have always been extremely frenzied and difficult to defeat. There's a saying in the art of war that a mourning army is bound to win. It's never just a saying because such a troop dares to charge forward and risk their lives no matter what enemy they're facing. I dare say that even with the 9 Supremes' help, they might not be able to shake the 300,000 mourning soldiers. The 9 Supremes' greatest influence on the battlefield comes from their control of the heaven and earth's power. Ordinary people are extremely fearful of them, losing their will to fight the moment they encounter them. They only have the thought of running for their lives, but these 300,000 mourning soldiers have already surpassed an ordinary person's concept of life and death. They'll still die, but they're truly unafraid of death. Against such a troop, the 9 Supremes can hardly unleash their full potential. It's truly frightening and unshakable. Facing such mourning soldiers, no matter how strong the opposition in Dongxian is, as long as anyone or any force dares to step out and speak ill of Han Sanhe or impose any sort of punishment on the Han family, they'll be torn to shreds by Dongxuan's military regardless of the cost. Chapter 520. Yunyang looked at Fu Baoguo. All in all, Marshal Fu, you're just a pure soldier, while Han Sanhe, other than being the most outstanding soldier, was also an extremely incisive politician. He could even make use of his own life and death so thoroughly. It's equally frightening and shocking. Fu Baoguo chuckled dryly. How can I be as thorough as young Master Yun? The only thought that crossed my mind just now was that as a fellow soldier, and as such a respectable military legend, I must help you. Even if I have to bear the blame, I must do it. He turned to stare into Yun Yang's eyes and said, I will personally report this matter to His Majesty. I will not shirk my responsibility. Yun Yang smiled and said, Marshal Fu, are you afraid that I'll snitch on you to His Majesty? Han Sanhe's calling me a descendant of nobility just now has such an effect. It has subtly driven a wedge between Marshal Fu and me. Marshal Fu has never seen eye to eye with me. Now that I have the identity of a royal relative, my stance is even more subtle. Am I right? Fu Baoguo felt awkward and said, I didn't mean that, I really didn't mean that. Young Master Yun, you're thinking too much. Yun Yang laughed heartily and lowered his voice to say, Marshal Fu, regarding this matter, I think it's best to end it here. In this world, probably only you, I, and heaven and earth know about this subtlety. Dongxuan's military hates you to the core. No matter what, you're the one who forced Han Sanhe to his death on the surface. So, we don't have to create additional trouble for ourselves and trouble ourselves for nothing. Suddenly, Fu Baoguo studied Yun Yang from head to toe seriously, as if he was getting to know Yun Yang all over again. Yun Yang wore an honest smile on his face. Marshal Fu, it's better not to leak some gossip and information if you can. You have to know that even the most enlightened monarch will be suspicious. No matter how fair and open the imperial court is, it's inevitable that there will be conflicts. Especially when it involves great benefits, there will be situations where one has no choice but to do it despite knowing that it shouldn't be done. Fu Baogua sighed softly. Yes, Yunyang continued, as for me, I'm only a marquis's young master. Even if I have the royal bloodline, it's impossible for me to be acknowledged by the royal family in this lifetime. Naturally, it's impossible for me to participate in the division of that big cake. Actually, with my cultivation base level, ordinary worldly benefits are nothing to me. Isn't it too arrogant of me to say this? Hehe. Fu Baogua could not help grinning as he said, of course it's arrogant, but it's more practical. He pondered for a moment and said, if that's the case, then I'll keep this matter to myself. No one will believe me even if I tell them. Yunyang understood and said, even so, I'll keep it to myself. By the way, when Marshal Fu returns to the capital to report on his work, you must treat me to a drink. Fu Baogua laughed heartily. No problem. I'll get someone to dig a huge pond and fill it with fine wine. Then I'll prepare plenty of meat and let you stay there. I've long heard of young Master Yun's past reputation. I'm not afraid of your magnanimity. Yunyang guffawed. The legendary debauchery? Then it's a deal. I won't go back on my word. Then both of them turned and rode their horses back. The war has come to an end. Looking at the situation, I believe that Dongxian won't have any major military movements for at least 3 years. What plans do you have after this, Marshal Fu? Asked Yunyang. I've promised Lord Supreme Cloud that I'll guard the Fortress of Resilience with my life. Fu Baogua said respectfully, although the original Fortress of Resilience has been destroyed, I plan to mobilize more manpower and strive to build a new fort that's a few times stronger than the previous one within these 2 years. There won't be any disturbances on the eastern border in the short term, so success is assured. The destruction of the Fortress of Resilience this time can be said to be complete. It's destroyed from its foundation, so it's convenient for me to start anew and rebuild it. Speaking of this, Fu Baogua looked excited. Even if war really breaks out 2 to 3 years later, the new Fortress of Resilience will definitely let Dongxian know that this is a tough bone that they can't even chew through. The world's strongest fort is still right in front of them. Yunyang said quietly, wrong? Fu Baogua was stunned. Wrong? Yunyang said, Marshal Fu's thinking is too conservative. The existence of the Fortress of Resilience in the past was to defend against Dongxian. This is understandable. It's because Dongxian has the world's top military force and the world's top marshal. Facing such a strong combination, it's only right to prioritize defense. However, from today onwards, Dongxian will have none of that. Especially after losing Han Sanhe's suppression, the civil and military infighting in Dongshuan's imperial court will be unprecedentedly intense. Yunyang said calmly, therefore your rebuilding of the Fortress of Resilience with the intention of guarding the territory has already done more harm than good. The effect is extremely limited. I hope that Marshal Fu can turn the new Fortress of Resilience into a fortress that focuses on offense. From now on, Yutong will no longer be a country that can be bullied or invaded. The basic direction of our strategy will change from defense to offense. Yunyang turned to look at Fu Baogua and said with a smile, perhaps the great undertaking of invading other countries, expanding our territory and unifying the world will begin in 2 to 3 years. Marshal Fu, perhaps such a great undertaking will come from your hands? Yunyang beamed brightly. Completed? The more he thought about it, the brighter his eyes shone. Suddenly he slapped his thigh and said, that's right, why didn't I think of it? Thanks to young master's reminder, Dongshuan's military force has shrunk greatly without Han Sanhe. What's there to be afraid of? Wait, I have to think about this again. How should the new Fortress of Resilience be built? I need to gather some talents who know how to build a fortress and brainstorm. Oh, this is absolutely great news. As he spoke and thought, he was exhilarated, wishing that he could start working on it right now. Yunyang looked at Fu Baogua who was grinning like a fool as he thought about the great achievements of expanding the territory. Yunyang could not help but smile. Fu Baogua did not look like the top-notch marshal that Han Sanhe had described him to be. He looked like a silly boy. Fu Baogua, who was being stared at by Yunyang, only snapped out of his daze after he had been grinning like a fool for a long time. Feeling embarrassed, he asked with a straight face, why are you here? Yunyang was stunned. Why am I here? That's right. Why am I here? Fu Baogua retorted angrily, Shouldn't you be escorting old Marshal back to the capital now? Why are you on the battlefield? Yunyang, how should you be punished for leaving your post without permission? Yunyang was shocked by the accusation. Marshal Fu, your teacher isn't actually old Grand Commandant Fong, is he? Your teacher should be old Marshal Qiu Jianhan. This kind of hooligan method of burning the bridge after crossing the river and putting the blame on someone else is simply at the pinnacle of perfection. You can do whatever you want as you please. Bah, it should be said as you like. Just open your mouth. Do you dare to be any more shameless? Fu Baoguo was relentless. I'm talking about military duty with you now. Your current responsibility and the position you're supposed to be in aren't here. Why are you making a false accusation? Tell me, where's old Marshal Qiu? He wouldn't be nearby, would he? Yunyang was helpless. Of course not. He should be 3,000 miles away now. You bastard. Fu Baoguo scolded him unceremoniously. Still spouting nonsense here? Aren't you going to chase after him to protect him? Do you still want to earn battle merits? Are you one of my soldiers? Yunyang was fuming, wishing that he could reveal his identity as Supreme Cloud and beat this fellow up. He could not help but curse inwardly. I've helped you deal with a 1,000,000-strong army, helped you win this battle, and even given you so many good ideas and painted such a beautiful future. I didn't expect you to be born in the year of the dog, biting me as soon as you turn around. Not only is he born in the year of the King dog, he's a typical mad dog. Can't you be more of a hooligan? Yunyang had obviously overlooked an important point. Although Qiu Jianhan was the head of the capital city's top 3 rogues and was the most reputable, the more a dog bit, the less it barked. For example, old Grand Commandant Fang Qingtian, who was also one of the top 3 rogues, and his successor Fu Baoguo. In front of Supreme Cloud, Fu Baoguo could only feel inferior and allow the latter to say whatever he wanted. However, the person in question was Yunyang, and now that the conflict had calmed down, when else would he be waiting for Yunyang? So what if he was handsome? I'll rush over right away. Yunyang was full of complaints as he said angrily, "Goodbye, sir. No, it's best if we don't meet again." Hold on, I've already promised to make you a place of debauchery. How can we not meet again? Oh, this horse of yours is not bad. Why don't you leave it with me? Fu Baoguo's eyes shone. Where's your shame? Can you be any more shameless than that? Yunyang's face was dark as he cursed unabashedly with his red teeth. Then he clamped his legs on the horse's abdomen. Reddy looked at Fu Baoguo in disdain and snorted, snorting all over Fu Baoguo's face before it left like a gust of wind. *CKme. Why is this beast so fierce? Fu Baoguo wiped his face hastily. Then he sighed. So many good brothers, gone just like that. After chasing Yunyang away, Fu Baoguo stood alone on the battlefield. Suddenly, sorrow welled up in his heart as tears gushed out like a fountain. Prostrating himself on the horse, he covered his face with both hands and wept in a repressed manner. There was really no image left to speak of. My brothers, when there was no one around, Fu Baoguo was shaking like a child as he cried. Who said that a man does not shed tears easily? It was only because he had yet to be heartbroken. On the battlefield, the setting sun shone through the thick layers of clouds. A man and a horse drew long shadows on the pure white snowy ground that was dyed red by fresh blood. When he was sure that there were no outsiders, the marshal's suppressed sobs and indescribable sorrow finally erupted. Chapter 521. The sky gradually darkened. The battlefield was then engulfed in the boundless night. High up in the sky, a pair of doubtful eyes were hidden in the clouds, looking down at the scene below, but it was filled with an inexplicable feeling. Supreme Cloud, who is he? Listening to this, it seems like Han Sanha has a suspect. Could it be that there are clues related to this in Dongxian? This Yunyang, he's obviously not Supreme Cloud. He's too young. Especially when he was under surveillance the entire time. From the moment he entered the battlefield, he was ordered around by the marshals and generals. There's nothing suspicious about him at all. Most importantly, when he entered the battlefield, the 9 Supremes attacked at the same time. Yunyang can't be Supreme Cloud then. Then who is Supreme Cloud? It's a pity that Han Sanha died too soon. A clue related to the 9 Supremes was cut off just as soon as it appeared. What fate, what fate, the person in the clouds was mumbling to himself. Suddenly, 8 dazzling rays of light fell from the sky like stars, like meteorites falling to the ground. In just an instant, the 8 rays of light pierced through the clouds and landed on the ground almost at the same time. The entire land suddenly fell into a peculiar state of undulating up and down. It was as if many huge earth dragons were rolling and moving under the ground. The 8 colors of red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, purple, and black constantly flickered on the ground. After a while, they disappeared abruptly. The power of the 9 Supremes? The person in the sky suddenly opened his eyes wide, his eyes filled with astonishment and astonishment. 8 of the 9 Supremes are really dead. This is... Thinking about it, the frustration in the man's heart rose to its peak, almost crushing his own head into smithereens. I see. So this is the truth. It was the spiritual restraining formation that prevented the 9 Supremes from unleashing their powers, but the powers of the manifestations didn't dissipate. Instead, they were sealed in Tianshan Cliff, and the so-called reappearance of the 9 Supremes this time is actually caused by the release of those powers? No wonder the powers are like trees without roots, unable to persist for long despite being powerful. This is the truth. As for the strange light now, should it be the final bloom of the 9 Supremes' power, or what? Why would 8 different types of light suddenly descend upon this land? This piece of land, there's clearly no longer any signs of life within 1,000 miles. What the hell is going on? Is it just fate or is there something else? What are your plans? Yun Yang found the 12 children in the Steel Cavalry's camp. But now there were only 8 left. The faces of the 8 of them were filled with sorrow. However, his expression was filled with determination. If you want to go home, I can make the decision to let you leave, Yun Yang said. If the 8 slightly immature faces hesitated for a moment, we want to take a leave of absence. Send our brothers' bodies back first, then come back to the Fortress of Resilience. Why? Yun Yang frowned. 4 men have been lost in one battle. Aren't you all afraid? Don't you care? He was in a dilemma. These little fellows were so determined. How was he going to explain this to their families? How could it be so fun to join the army to fight a war? The leader of the children was called Li Erden. After joining the army, he had given himself a name, Li Zhan. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "Teacher, we know that it doesn't bode well if we stay here, but we're even more unwilling to go back just like this. Firstly, we still have to avenge our 4 brothers. Secondly, we like this atmosphere, we like the battlefield, we like the military camp. Thirdly," he stuttered and snuck a peek at Yun Yang's expression, saying, "Staying here, although it's cruel, although we have to face life and death at all times, come out, whether it's cruel or tragic, we've seen the outside world after all." Yun Yang understood it all at once. It was true. Coming out of a small, isolated village, it was fine if they could not see the vast world, spending the rest of their lives peacefully in a small valley. However, once these hot-blooded youths had seen the outside world, how could they be willing to return to the isolated village and spend the rest of their lives in silence? Yun Yang was silent for a moment before he said, "If you all want a place to live, you can follow me back to the capital. I'll be watching over you there. It's much better than staying here." The 8 children were silent for a moment. Yun Yang could feel the resistance in the silence. It was a resistance of pride. "We want to work our way out with our own strength," Li Zhan said softly. "Ambitious," Yun Yang said approvingly. The 8 youths blushed together. Yun Yang took out a mystical qi cultivation manual that he had prepared earlier and explained it in detail. He then watched as the 8 children practiced. "No matter where you all stay," Yun Yang said in a low voice, "never forget where your roots are. Do you understand?" "Yes." The 8 youths' eyes shone brightly. "No matter where you are, no matter what achievements you have in the future, never forget the comrades and brothers who have fought alongside you. Never forget the comrades and brothers who have sacrificed themselves by your side. Do you understand? Don't ever forget their families. Never forget, as a man, the responsibility towards his friends, parents, family, country, and the relatives of his comrades who have sacrificed themselves," Yin Yang said in a low voice. His gaze was hollow. Wang Dinghua watched quietly from the side. When Yun Yang said all this, he could clearly feel the sincerity and sense of responsibility that was almost overflowing from him. The weight of each word was as heavy as a mountain. He could not help but look solemn as well. "We will remember teacher's teachings." The 8 youths knelt on the ground at the same time and kowtowed. "Wang Dinghua." Yun Yang turned and said, "Take good care of them, but they don't need special care. Do you understand?" It was a contradictory sentence. However, Wang Dinghua understood once he heard it. He said seriously, "Don't worry, young Master Yun. Old Wang understands." Yun Yang nodded and took out a few banknotes from his pocket. "Send them back home?" The youths were about to decline when Yun Yang glared at them. "The brothers who have sacrificed themselves are not going to eat at home?" He shoved them over forcefully. The 8 youths' voices were choked. Those were 500,000 taels worth of banknotes. Even Wang Dinghua, who was watching from the side, was envious. However, Wang Dinghua had made up his mind. No matter what, he had to send these children back. This money belonged only to the small village. No one could touch it. Yin Yang left. He felt a little relieved but also a little disappointed. Working hard by themselves, starting from scratch. The dreams of the youths were always so naive, filled with passion. Yin Yang did not object to it. He would let them work on their own. Perhaps one day they would become the new legend of starting from scratch. Who could say for sure? However, Yin Yang did not wish for them to realize the importance of relationships, connections, society, human relations. One day and extinguish their passion to work hard before going to the capital city to look for him. Yin Yang did not wish to see that. No matter what, the path of life was always one's own choice. At a certain stage, at a certain fork in the road, the left and right sides would lead to heaven and hell respectively. However, the entrance would be the same. Some would choose heaven, but some would go to hell if they made the wrong choice. In spite of this, there was still the possibility of falling to hell and heaven. There was also a path to heaven and hell. Bless you all. Never change your original intentions in this life. Never forget your original intentions. This blessing was etched in Yin Yang's heart. The 8 youths watched their teacher gallop away into the night, their eyes filled with respect and gratitude. The purple robe would forever remain in the depths of their hearts. Teacher, you must take care. The 8 youths knelt down silently. Facing the faraway land where the figure had disappeared, they kowtowed silently. Rise, children. Wang Dinghua sighed inwardly. You will see your teacher again in the future. Yin Yang, who was already far away and nearing the boundary of Tianshan Cliff, galloped across the snowy plains like a red shadow. However, just as he passed by Tianshan Cliff's boundary, he suddenly heard a loud boom. Yin Yang looked up in shock. The 9 Supremes temples that stood tall on Tianshan Cliff suddenly collapsed without any warning, turning into fine rubble that littered the ground in an instant. No! Yin Yang cried out instinctively. Then he was dumbstruck, his eyes wide as he screamed, "Why?" It was at this moment that an inexplicable force suddenly surged out from the ground. In less than a tenth of a blink of an eye, it quietly melted into Yin Yang's body, meridians, and dantian. The entire process was simply faster than a bolt of lightning, and it only took the blink of an eye for it to come to an end. It was like a clay ox entering the sea, and there was no further movement. Yin Yang jolted abruptly. It was a familiar force that had fused with him. It was a feeling that only existed when his brothers were together. Brothers? Yin Yang felt an insuppressible wave of sorrow, but he understood what had happened instantly. He had used his identity as Supreme Cloud to trigger the manifestation power of the 9 Supremes that his brothers had left behind. His brother's dying wish, or rather, everyone's hope of merging the 9 Supremes into one, had all been poured into him. After he had triggered this force, he had also triggered his brother's dying wills that had been sealed together. Previously, when the 9 Supremes' power had struck Dongshuan's army, it had only lasted for a short period of time. It was not that the 9 Supremes' power had stopped there, but the remnant wills of the 9 Supremes had retained most of their power and followed him here. In other words, although Yin Yang was still unable to use any of the 9 Supremes' cultivation methods or abilities, he was now truly one with the 9 Supremes. In the most thorough and extreme way they had merged into one. Yin Yang, who was well aware of this, did not feel the slightest bit of joy. He lay on the horse's back, trembling as tears streamed down his cheeks. Brothers, will I never be able to see you all again? The merging of the 9 Supremes into one was the last wish of the deceased 9 Supremes, but it was also the situation that Yin Yang was most unwilling to see. This was because when the 9 Supremes' powers merged into one, it also meant that the original 9 Supremes' traces would be completely erased from this world from this moment onwards. The sky suddenly brightened in a way that it had never been before. On this unusually cold night, a curtain of light that was as bright as day appeared. The gloomy clouds that filled the sky dissipated without a trace in the blink of an eye, as if they had been hit by a hurricane that could destroy the world. The galaxy was bright, the moon was high in the sky. Yin Yang lifted his head to look at the starry sky. Looking at the countless twinkling stars in the sky, it was as if he could see Supreme Earth and the others' faces that he had not seen for a long time. They were smiling and blinking at him in the sky, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. Yin Yang could not help the sorrow that welled up in his heart. In the sea of clouds, a man who was covered in chains leaned against a tree, looking at the sky and smiling faintly. Not bad, not bad. This day has finally arrived. When the 9 Supremes return, the earth will split and the sky will be overturned. The martial world will be dominated by the Supremes. Mr. Nyan, your good days are coming. As for me, Heaven's Inquisition. I'm finally going to be free. I've been trapped here all these years. I wonder what the outside world is like. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.